He threw the papers at her feet like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. That was the first thing Alara Whitmore saw when she stepped off the wagon and into the life she never chose. A man she'd never met standing in the mud of his own yard, jaw set like stone, eyes like a winter that had forgotten spring existed, hurling a folded contract onto the ground in front of her and saying, loud enough for every hand on the property to hear, "I didn't send for a school teacher. I sent that letter back. Whoever arranged this made a mistake, and I'm not paying for somebody else's mistake." Alara didn't pick up the papers. She looked at them lying in the mud, then she looked at him. She had come 2,000 miles for this. If you've ever been dropped into a place where nobody wanted you, where every face around you had already decided what you were worth before you opened your mouth, then you already know what Alara felt standing in that yard. And if you haven't, then watch what she does next. Because this is a story about what happens when a woman refuses to be what the world tells her to be. This channel tells stories that stay with you. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss what comes next, because I promise you, this one is going to surprise you. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that yard. Huang. The morning Alara Whitmore arrived at the Voss Ranch, the sky over Montana Territory was the color of a bruise. That particular shade of gray-green that rolls in before a storm decides to make its intentions known. She had been traveling for 11 days. She had lost one trunk somewhere between St. Louis and the last relay station, eaten food she wouldn't have offered to a stray dog, and slept sitting upright on 3 separate occasions because there was nowhere else to put her body. She was 29 years old, which in 1883 meant most people had already written a quiet story for her in their heads. Spinster, dependent, somebody's problem. Her father had certainly written that story. He'd written it in the form of a letter sent to a land broker in Helena, who passed it to a ranch owner named Caleb Voss, who apparently, according to the broker's cheerful correspondence, had agreed to the arrangement. Apparently was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Caleb Voss was not a tall man, but he took up space the way certain men do. Like the air around him was slightly compressed, like whatever room or yard he occupied had to rearrange itself to accommodate his presence. He was 41, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who didn't believe in softness, and eyes that were not unkind so much as completely uninvested in being kind. He'd spent 20 years building this ranch with his hands and his back, and what she would later learn was a truly ferocious stubbornness, and he had the posture of a man who was not accustomed to explaining himself to anyone. He had not, it became clear within the first 30 seconds, agreed to this arrangement. "The broker wrote that you confirmed," Alara started. "The broker wrote what the broker wrote." Caleb cut her off without raising his voice, which was somehow worse than shouting. "I told him I'd consider it. Considering something and agreeing to it are not the same thing, and any man worth his salt knows the difference." Around them, 3 ranch hands had stopped whatever they were doing. Not conspicuously. They were still holding tools, still positioned near their work, but their eyes were doing the thing eyes do when something interesting is happening and nobody wants to admit they're watching. Alara looked at the contract in the mud one more time. Then she looked back at Caleb. "Are you going to pick that up?" she said, "or are you waiting for the rain to do it for you?" One of the ranch hands, a young one, barely 18, with ears that stuck out past his hat, made a sound that might have been a cough. Caleb's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, some tiny recalibration, like he'd expected a different response and had to file this one somewhere he didn't have a folder for yet. "You've got nowhere to go," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's correct," Alara said. "Then you can sleep in the house tonight. Tomorrow we figure out what to do with you." He turned and walked back toward the barn. No further instruction, no greeting, no acknowledgement that she had just traveled 11 days to stand in his mud and be told she was a logistical problem. Alara picked up the contract herself, smoothed it against her coat, folded it, and put it in her pocket. She had, at that moment, $12.40 to her name. The return fare to anywhere worth going was approximately $60. She was going to need a different plan. The house was not what she'd expected, which meant it was both worse and more interesting than the picture the broker's letter had painted. The letter had described a substantial homestead property, which turned out to mean a structure that was structurally sound, but had apparently given up on aesthetics sometime around 1876. The main room held a table, 4 mismatched chairs, a wood stove that was doing its best, and approximately 16 years' worth of the particular disorder that accumulates when a man lives alone and doesn't see the point of addressing it. A woman named Dottie Crane, who cooked for the ranch 3 days a week and appeared to tolerate Caleb with the weary patience of someone who had known him too long to be surprised by him, showed Alara to a room at the back of the house. It was small. It had a window. The window looked out over the cattle pens, which meant the smell was not pleasant, but there was a latch on the door and a real mattress on the bed, and after 11 days of travel, Alara sat on it and felt her spine thank her in a language she hadn't realized she'd been missing. "He's not as bad as he seems," Dottie said from the doorway, with the tone of a woman who had said this before and wasn't entirely sure she believed it. "He seems like a man who throws legal documents in the mud," Alara said. "Well," Dottie considered this. "He's not worse than that." She left. Alara sat in the room and looked at the wall and thought about her father. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, was a man who had built his entire sense of self on the conviction that he was smarter than the situations he created. He was an attorney. A good one, technically. And he had the lawyer's particular gift for arranging facts into an argument that sounded reasonable even when the underlying reality was not. He had arranged Alara's life with the same approach. She was an asset that had not returned adequate value, and he had found what he considered an efficient solution. She had not been consulted. When she'd said as much, he had said, "Alara, you are not a child. You understand how the world works." And what he'd meant was, "You understand that I make the decisions and you adjust to them." She had not adjusted quietly, which was why the conversation had lasted 3 hours and ended with her walking out of his house with the carpet bag that was now sitting on the floor of a room that smelled like cattle, in a territory she had never visited, married, or near enough to it, to a man who had dropped the paperwork in the dirt. She pulled the contract out of her pocket and read it again, carefully, the way she read everything, which was to say the way a person reads who has been told their whole life that they don't need to bother and has spent that whole life bothering anyway. The contract was, legally speaking, not a marriage certificate. It was a labor and residence agreement with a cohabitation clause, which the broker had apparently explained to her father as essentially the same thing. It was not essentially the same thing, but it did give her the right to occupy the property for a minimum of 90 days before either party could dissolve the arrangement, and it stipulated that Caleb Voss was responsible for her basic provision during that period. 90 days. Alara folded the contract and put it back in her pocket. She had 90 days to make herself impossible to send away. Well, dinner that night was a revelation, though not a pleasant one. There were 5 people at the table: Caleb, Alara, a foreman named Roy Hubbard, who had the handshake and the eyes of a man used to being the most trusted person in any room, Dottie, on account of it being one of her 3 days, and the boy with the ears, whose name turned out to be Thomas, and who kept looking at Alara with the open curiosity of someone who has never seen a species up close before. Caleb had not apparently told anyone what to do about the situation, which meant everyone was managing it in their own way. Roy managed it by addressing all remarks to a point approximately 6 inches to Alara's left. Thomas managed it by asking her if she'd ever seen a buffalo, which, given that she'd just crossed the entire territory, seemed like an odd question, but was clearly offered in good faith. Dottie managed it by passing things before they were asked for, which Alara recognized as the behavior of someone trying to reduce friction through preemptive action. Caleb managed it by eating and not speaking. Alara ate, and while she ate, she listened. What she heard, in the spaces between the ordinary sentences, in the way Roy said, "the south pasture fence again," with a particular flatness, in the way Caleb's jaw tightened at the phrase Henderson's crew, in the fact that Thomas had started to mention something about the cattle count and then stopped when Roy gave him a look, was the sound of a ranch that was in more trouble than it knew how to talk about at dinner. "How many head do you run?" she asked. Silence. Not hostile, exactly. More the silence of people who had not expected the question from that direction. Caleb looked at her for the first time since they'd sat down. "Why?" "I'm curious." "It's not your concern." "I live here," Alara said, "for 90 days, legally, whether you like it or not. It seems like it might become my concern." Roy cleared his throat. Thomas found something very interesting to examine on his fork. Caleb said, 412 head, down from 602 this time last year. The number landed on the table like something heavy. What happened to the other 188? Ilara asked. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He seemed to be deciding something. Not about the answer, she thought, but about her. About what kind of person asked that kind of follow-up question. Winter. Rustlers. Henderson. He said the three words like they were roughly equivalent forces of nature. Henderson is the neighboring ranch? Henderson is a land-grabbing snake who's been trying to squeeze this operation into the ground for 4 years, Roy said, with the careful tone of a man who was saying the diplomatic version of what he actually thought. Roy, Caleb said quietly. She's going to hear it eventually, Roy said. Caleb set down his fork. He looked at Ilara with an expression that was not quite unfriendly and not quite anything else. A holding pattern, she thought. A man waiting to see what she would do before he decided what to think. Finish your dinner, he said. We start before sunrise. I'll be up, she said. He didn't say anything to that, but he didn't tell her not to be either. She was up at 4:30, which was earlier than she needed to be and later than she wanted. She'd lain awake for 2 hours in the dark, listening to the ranch settle around her, cataloging sounds. The cattle. The wind. A loose board somewhere on the roof that knocked when a gust came through at a particular angle. The distant bark of a dog she hadn't met yet. She was making coffee when Caleb came into the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway, looked at her standing at his stove with a cup in her hand. Then he looked at the coffee pot. I found where you keep things, she said. I hope that's all right. It clearly had not occurred to him that she might simply find where things were kept and use them. She could see it in the brief recalibration of his face. He was used to being the first one up. He was used to this room being empty until Dottie arrived. He was used to a house that operated on his schedule and his terms. It's fine, he said, in the tone of a man who was not certain it was fine, but was not prepared to make it a confrontation. She handed him the cup she'd poured for herself, went and got another. He stood at the table and drank it in silence for a moment. Outside, the darkness was beginning to soften at its edges. Not light yet, but the suggestion that light was somewhere in its plans. You can ride? He asked. Yes. Actually ride. Not like a park. My uncle had a horse farm in Virginia, she said. I grew up on it until I was 14. He looked at her again with that measuring quality she was beginning to understand was his default mode. A man who trusted information only as far as he could verify it. I'll believe it when I see it, he said. That's fine, she said. I tend to prefer being believed after the fact anyway. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was more like the ghost of the place a smile might someday occupy. And it was gone before she could be certain it had been there at all. But she had seen it. She filed it away. What? The morning ride was supposed to be Caleb's inspection of the south pasture fence, which Roy had flagged as needing attention before the season turned. What it became was also, incidentally, Ilara's first real look at the land, and the land told her things immediately, the way land does if you've grown up paying attention to it. She didn't say anything for the first 40 minutes. She just looked. At the fence lines, yes, but also at the grass patterns, the way water had moved across certain sections, the position of the sun against the hills to the west. At the cattle she could see in the north section, and the way they were bunched in a configuration that said something about the quality of the grazing they had access to. Caleb noticed her looking, but didn't ask what she was looking at. Roy was with them, and he and Caleb talked about the fence in the shorthand of two men who had been working the same problem from the same angle for so long that they didn't need to explain their terms to each other. She listened to that too. Then they came to the south pasture fence, and she saw the problem. It wasn't just a loose section. There were 3 separate places where the wire had been cut and retwisted. Someone had tried to make it look like weather damage, but the cuts were too clean, the retwists too deliberate. This wasn't wind, she said. Both men turned to look at her. She pointed at the nearest section. Wind pulls the wire loose or breaks the post. It doesn't cut through the wire and then try to put it back. Someone was here. Roy walked over and crouched down, looked at the wire, looked at Caleb. Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. I was staring at the fence with an expression she couldn't read yet. She was still learning his face, which was a face that had spent years being very deliberate about what it revealed. Henderson's been getting bolder, Roy said quietly. When did this happen? Ilara asked. Don't know, Roy said. Could have been last week. Could have been 3 nights ago, Caleb said. Thomas checked this section 3 days back and it was solid. 3 days. 3 days of knowing or suspecting and still reacting to it as a fence problem rather than an intelligence problem, which meant, how many other sections has he touched? Alara asked. Caleb looked at her. The question had come out flat and precise, and she could see it had landed differently than he'd expected. Not soft, not tentative, not the voice of someone still finding her footing. I don't know, he said. And from the way he said it, she could tell that not knowing bothered him more than he was willing to express. Then that's the first thing you need to find out, she said, before you repair anything. You map every section he's touched so you understand the pattern. Right now you're fixing fences. He's drawing a map. Roy looked at her, then at Caleb, then back at her. Caleb said, You're telling me how to run my ranch. I'm telling you what I see, Alara said. What you do with it is your business. He held her gaze for a moment that was uncomfortable in a way she suspected he intended it to be. A test of some kind, a pressure applied to see what cracked. She didn't crack. He looked back at the fence. Roy, get Thomas and Miguel. I want every section checked by dark. Roy nodded and turned his horse back toward the ranch without another word. Caleb didn't look at Alara again. He just nudged his horse forward along the fence line, continuing the inspection. But he didn't tell her to go back to the house. She followed. The conversation that ended the day, if you could call it a conversation, happened on the porch as the sun finished its work and left the sky in the hands of the cold. Alara had spent the afternoon cataloging. It was what she did when she was anxious and needed to feel useful. She organized what she knew into what she could see and what she could act on. She had walked the house. She had walked the parts of the property Caleb hadn't told her she couldn't go to. She had found the ranch's ledger in the desk in the main room. Not snooping, the desk had been open, and she had not read it because it wasn't hers to read yet. Yet. Caleb was sitting on the porch steps when she came out. He had a cup of something that was not coffee, and he was looking at the dark like it owed him an explanation. How bad is it? She said. She didn't sit down. She stood at the edge of the porch with her arms crossed against the cold. He didn't ask what she meant. That told her something. Bad enough, he said. The ledger's in the desk, she said. I didn't look at it, but I could. I've kept books before, my father's office, and for 2 years at a dry goods business in Cincinnati. If you want someone to look at it with different eyes, I can do that. Silence. Wind. The dog barked somewhere. You're not what I was expecting, he said finally. He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like a problem he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure how to account for. What were you expecting? She asked. He turned and looked at her. Straight on, for the first time really. Not the sideways assessment of someone cataloging a problem, but direct, like he'd decided the evasion cost more than it was worth. Someone I could ignore, he said. Someone who'd figure out in a week she didn't belong here and ask to go home. I don't have a home to go to, Alara said. I know. Then you know why I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned back to the dark. Don't touch the ledger tonight, he said. I'll get it tomorrow. It was not permission, exactly. It was not a welcome. It was a man who had spent 20 years trusting nobody, taking the smallest possible step in a direction he wasn't sure of, for reasons he hadn't finished understanding yet. Alara went inside. She sat on the edge of her bed in the room that smelled like cattle and looked at the wall and thought, 90 days. She had made it through the first one. Caleb brought the ledger out the next morning. He set it on the table without ceremony, just put it down in front of her while she was finishing her coffee and said, Don't make it into something it isn't, which she understood to mean, don't read anything into this. Don't assume it means trust. Don't mistake a practical decision for a personal one. I won't, she said, and opened it. The ledger was a mess. Not dishonest. She could see immediately that the numbers were real, recorded by a man who understood what he was counting, even if he didn't understand how to organize what he'd counted. The entries went back 6 years, written in 2 different hands, Caleb's, which was cramped and angular and pressed hard into the page like he was trying to make the ink commit, and someone else's, earlier, with a rounder style that stopped abruptly in the spring of 1879. She didn't ask about the second hand, not yet. What the numbers told her, once she started sorting them into some kind of order in her head, was a story that was more complicated than "the ranch is struggling." The ranch had been profitable, genuinely profitable, as recently as 3 years ago. Not wealthy, but solid. The kind of numbers that meant a man could look at his land and feel it was returning what he put into it. Then something had shifted. Not a single event. A slow erosion. Prices for beef dropping at the regional market, while the cost of everything the ranch needed to buy kept climbing. Feed, wire, labor. And underneath those numbers, a pattern she had to look at twice before she was sure she was seeing it correctly. "Your selling prices dropped faster than the regional average," she said. Caleb was sitting across the table from her, not looking at the ledger, looking at the wall in the way he had that meant he was listening even though his face was somewhere else. "Market goes up and down." "It does, but your prices dropped more than your neighbors. In the same season, with the same buyers." She turned the ledger around and pointed at the column she meant. "You're selling through Henderson's broker." Silence. "Not directly," she said. "But the broker your cattle go through. Marsh, is that the name? He's Henderson's man. I don't know if you knew that." The quality of the silence changed. She had been around enough men who prided themselves on knowing things to recognize the particular weight of a silence that meant, "I did not know that, and knowing it now is humiliating in a way I have not finished processing." "Where did you get that from?" Caleb said. "The ledger. Marsh's name, the dates, and the price differential. I don't have the connection to Henderson from these numbers. That's something you'd have to find out through other means. But the pattern is there." She paused. "If I'm wrong, you can tell me I'm wrong." He looked at the ledger now, really looked at it, in the focused way of a man who was revising something he thought he already understood. Roy had come in from outside at some point during this and was standing near the stove with his hat in his hands, not drinking the coffee he'd come in to get. "Marsh has been running cattle sales in this valley for 15 years, Roy said carefully. "That doesn't mean he's not working two sides of the same arrangement," Ilara said. Roy looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the numbers. The kitchen was quiet enough that she could hear the stove ticking. "Who else would you sell through?" Caleb said. It wasn't a concession. It was a real question. The question of a man who had operated inside a system so long he'd stopped imagining it differently. "I don't know yet," Ilara said, "but finding out is more important than fixing the south pasture fence." Caleb stood up from the table. He picked up his hat and turned it once in his hands. A habit she was starting to recognize, something he did when he was ending a conversation before he said something he'd regret. "I'll talk to Marsh," he said. "Don't tell him you suspect anything," Ilara said quickly. He stopped, looked at her. "I know how to have a conversation." "I know you do. I'm saying the conversation you know how to have is the kind where you look a man in the eye and expect him to be honest because that's how you operate. He won't be honest. He'll just know you're watching him." The look on Caleb's face was not quite anger. It was something adjacent to it. The friction between a man's self-image and information that doesn't fit inside it. He was not a naive man. He didn't think of himself as someone who got played. Being told that he might have been played by a woman he'd known for 36 hours, in his own kitchen, in front of his foreman, was a specific kind of difficult. "Then what," he said, "do you suggest?" "Let me write to a cattle broker in Miles City. One of my father's clients used him. He's reputable, and he operates outside Henderson's reach. We find out what your cattle would actually sell for on an open market." She closed the ledger. "Then you have something real to compare." Caleb looked at Roy. Roy's expression was carefully neutral in the way of a man who had an opinion and was keeping it behind his teeth because the room had enough tension already. "Write the letter," Caleb said finally. He walked to the door and stopped. Didn't turn around. "Don't tell me how to talk to a man again." He went out. The door didn't slam. He wasn't that kind of man. But it closed with a firmness that was the architectural equivalent of a period at the end of a sentence. Roy poured his coffee, looked at her. "You're either very smart or very reckless," he said, "and I haven't decided which yet." "Could be both," Ilara said. Roy almost smiled. Almost. He took his coffee and followed Caleb outside, and Ilara sat alone at the table with the ledger in front of her and let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 10 minutes. She had not made a friend. She had not won anything. But she had planted something in soil that might or might not take, and for now that was all she had to work with. She pulled a piece of paper from the desk and started writing to Miles City. The letter went out with the twice-weekly rider on a Tuesday. In the meantime, Ilara did what she always did when waiting made her anxious. She worked. She had identified in those first few days the three problems she could actually touch. The first was the broker situation, which was in motion. The second was the feed situation. The ranch was paying for hay from a supplier 2 towns over when there was perfectly serviceable grazing land sitting fallow on the east side of the property, ungrazed because the fence line along the creek had collapsed and not been repaired. Nobody had fixed it because fixing it required materials, and materials cost money, and the ranch's credit at the hardware store in Billings Crossing was not what it had been. Ilara did the arithmetic and found that repairing the fence would cost less than 2 months of hay delivery and would eliminate the need for that delivery indefinitely. She brought this to Caleb on a Thursday morning when he was saddling his horse in the barn and did not have the option of walking away without being rude about it. "The East Creek fence," she said, and laid out the numbers. He listened. He looked at the numbers she'd written on the paper. He said, "The creek floods in spring. The fence collapsed in a section that's uphill from the flood line. I checked." He said, "We don't have the hands to rebuild it right now." She said, "Thomas and I can do the main sections. Miguel said he'd help on Sunday if you approved it." He said nothing for a moment, saddled the horse with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done it thousands of times. "You asked Miguel?" he said. "I asked if he'd be willing, if you approved it," Ilara said. "I wasn't trying to go around you, but you talked to him before you talked to me." She had. It had seemed practical at the time. She wanted to know if the labor was available before proposing the plan. And she could see now that from his perspective it looked like she was building a structure that didn't include him, making arrangements on his property with his men. "You're right," she said. "I should have come to you first. I'm sorry." The apology caught him off guard. She could see it. The slight adjustment of his posture, like he'd braced for an argument and found himself leaning against a door that opened inward. "Sunday's fine," he said. "I'll help." He rode out. Ilara went back to the house with the odd sensation of having won something by conceding and not being entirely certain whether that was cleverness or compromise. It felt like both. It also felt like it mattered which one it was. The Sunday fence repair was where something shifted between them, though she wouldn't have been able to name it precisely at the time. It was cold work. The ground was half frozen, which made post setting into a physical argument between the iron bar and the earth, and the wire was stiff and unforgiving and not inclined to cooperate with hands that were losing feeling in the fingertips. Thomas was young enough to treat it like a challenge rather than a misery. Miguel worked with the quiet competence of a man who had been doing difficult things for so long that difficulty was just the baseline texture of a day. Caleb worked hard and said almost nothing, which was his ordinary mode, but there was something different in the way he worked alongside her. Not watching her for failure, exactly, but watching her. Registering what she could do. She could do quite a bit. Her uncle's horse farm had not been a decorative operation, and she had grown up in it the way children grow up in things. Not thinking about it as training, just as life. And then discovering later that life had taught her things she didn't know she knew. She could set a post. She could run wire. Her hands were not soft, and she didn't pretend they were. Around midday, when they stopped to eat the food Dottie had packed because it was one of her 3 days, and she had apparently decided that field lunch provision was within her unofficial scope, Caleb sat down on a fence post with a sandwich and looked at the section they'd finished. "This'll hold through spring," he said. It was directed at the fence, not at Ilara. "That was the plan," she said. Thomas was telling Miguel something about a horse that had gotten loose last winter, an involved story that required quite a bit of imitation of both the horse and the various people who had tried to catch it. Ilara listened with half her attention and watched Caleb with the other half. He was eating and looking at the land. At the east section, the fallow grass that would now be accessible to the cattle. At the creek line, which even in winter had a particular quality of light around it, the way water changed the air near it, made it slightly warmer, slightly more alive. "Your uncle's farm," he said, "in Virginia." "Yes." "What happened to it?" She hadn't expected the question. It was the first personal thing he had asked her, and it came out with a kind of deliberate casualness that she recognized as the way people asked things they'd been turning over for a while and had finally decided to risk. "My uncle died when I was 14, she said. "His sons took it over. My father moved us back to Cincinnati." She paused. I didn't want to go. Caleb looked at the grass. Where'd you want to stay? The farm, she said. It was the first place I ever understood. He didn't say anything to that, but he didn't end the conversation either, which from him she was learning to understand as a form of engagement. Ranch like this, he said eventually, it's either in your blood or it isn't. Doesn't matter what you know how to do. You think it isn't in mine, she said. I think I don't know yet, he said. And from a man who had assumed she'd be gone by the end of the first week, this was something. The reply from Miles City came on a Friday, 12 days after she'd sent the letter. She was in the main room when the rider came, and she took the envelope and sat with it for a moment before opening it, aware that what was inside would either confirm what she thought she'd seen in the ledger or make her look like a woman who'd caused a great deal of trouble for a theory that didn't hold. It held. The broker in Miles City, a man named Elwood, whose handwriting was small and precise and businesslike, quoted her current market rates for Montana Territory beef that were, per head, noticeably higher than the prices recorded in Caleb's ledger over the past 3 seasons. Not dramatically higher, not accusatorially higher, but consistently, measurably higher, in a way that over hundreds of head in multiple seasons added up to a number that made her sit still for a moment and just look at it. She found Caleb in the barn. She put the letter on the workbench beside him without speaking. He read it. Read it again. That's... He stopped, set the letter down, picked up the tool he'd been working with and put it down again. Over 3 years, accounting for what you ran in the years the numbers are clear, she said. The differential is somewhere between $2,000 and $2,500. He looked at the letter. Could be market variation, he said, but he said it the way a man says something he doesn't believe, checking whether saying it aloud makes it more convincing. It didn't. It could be, she said, but it's the same direction. Every season, while the regional market moved up and down, Marsh was consistently low. Caleb's hands were still on the workbench. She noticed that they were very still, which she was learning was the version of him that was most dangerous to misread. Not the controlled stillness of someone suppressing anger, but the stillness of someone thinking hard and fast, and not wanting the thinking to show. Henderson's been strangling us, he said, quietly. The way you say something when you've suspected it for years and finally have the shape of it in your hands and it's worse than the suspicion. Slowly, she said, through prices. So it looks like your ranch is failing rather than being failed. He turned and looked at her. She had seen him look at her before, the assessing look, the cautious look, the look that was trying to figure out what category she belonged in. This was a different look. This one didn't have a category. You figured this out from a ledger, he said. I figured out the pattern. You'll need someone who can verify the Henderson connection directly. I know who to ask. Roy, she said. Roy. He nodded. Then, I owe you an... He stopped, started again. You did good work. It was not a flowery speech. It was 4 words from a man for whom those 4 words cost something real, and she received them as what they were. Now we fix it, she said. Now we fix it, he agreed. The fixing was not fast, and it was not clean, and it began with a conversation between Caleb and Roy that lasted most of an evening and resulted in Roy riding out the next morning toward a property north of town where a rancher named Dale Pruitt operated a mid-sized cattle operation and was known, according to Roy, to have his own complicated history with Henderson. Alara did not go on that ride. She knew better than to push on that particular door. Caleb had accepted her usefulness in the realm of numbers and organization, but the world of men talking to men about things that might turn into confrontations was a world with its own protocols, and inserting herself into it uninvited would cost her more than it gained. Instead, she was on the property the morning Roy went to Pruitt's, and she did something she'd been planning since the first week. She introduced herself to the 2 ranch wives who lived within reasonable distance. Martha Ellison was the wife of a rancher named Gene Ellison, who ran a small operation 4 miles west, and she received Alara at her door with the cautious hospitality of a woman who had learned to be careful about who she trusted, but had not yet learned to be unkind about it. They drank tea. Martha talked about the winter, about the difficulty of getting supplies when the roads turned bad, about the price of flour. The price of flour, it emerged, was something Martha was specifically and recently angry about. The general store in Billings Crossing had raised prices twice in the past year, which was the kind of thing that happened, except that Martha had a sister in the next town who was paying considerably less. Same supplier, Martha said. Bill Crane told Jean it was freight costs, but my sister's town is farther from the railhead. Who owns the store in Billings Crossing? Ilara asked. Martha looked at her. You don't know? I've been here 3 weeks, Ilara said. Martha set down her cup. Gideon Blackwell, she said. Well, his cousin manages it, but everybody knows it's Blackwell's money. Gideon Blackwell. That was the second time she'd heard that name in a context that mattered, and it was enough to make a pattern. She stayed another hour at Martha's. She asked questions that sounded like ordinary conversation and were not. She learned that the Ellisons were 2 bad seasons away from having to sell, that at least 2 other families in the valley were in similar positions, and that nobody talked about it openly because nobody wanted to be seen as failing. The second ranch wife, Clara Vega, lived 6 miles east with her husband Antonio, who ran cattle on land his family had held for 30 years, and who had been fighting a water rights dispute for the past 18 months that seemed to have no resolution and was costing them money they didn't have in legal fees. A water rights dispute. Ilara asked who the dispute was with, though she thought she already knew. Blackwell, Clara said. The word had the weight of something that had been carried a long time. He says his upstream property changes the water allocation. The judge in the county keeps delaying. Antonio thinks... She stopped, looked at her hands. Antonio thinks it's going to take years we don't have. Ilara rode home with the wind in her face and a picture forming in her mind that was bigger and uglier than she'd thought when she'd started the morning. Henderson and Marsh were part of something. The store, the water dispute, the prices. They were not separate problems. They were the same problem operating through different mechanisms, and behind all of them was a name she was going to need to learn a great deal more about. She told Caleb that evening, all of it, Martha, Clara, Blackwell, the pattern. He listened from the other side of the table with his arms folded and his expression doing the thing it did when he was reconfiguring something he'd held as a fixed point. Henderson he'd known was an enemy. Blackwell was a different category of problem, larger, more organized, operating in a register he hadn't been looking at because he'd been too focused on the fence lines directly adjacent to his own. Blackwell's been buying up land in the northern part of the territory for 3 years, Roy said. He'd come back from Pruitt's that afternoon with his own new information. Pruitt thinks he's going for a full monopoly on the eastern corridor, control the grazing land, control the water, control the market access, and everybody in the valley either sells to him or starves. How far along is he? Ilara asked. Far enough, Roy said. Pruitt figures another 2 or 3 seasons, and there won't be enough independent operations left to fight back. The room was quiet. Thomas was not at the table for this conversation. Caleb had sent him on an errand, and the 3 of them sat with the size of what they were looking at and let it be the size it was. Fighting Blackwell with guns won't work, Ilara said. He has more men and more money and better lawyers. I'm aware, Caleb said, with the edge of a man who does not need the obvious stated, even when stating it is useful. So the fight has to be different, she said. The Ellisons, the Vegas, Pruitt, maybe 2 or 3 others. If they combine their cattle sales and go directly to Elwood and Miles City, they cut Marsh out entirely. Blackwell loses his price control mechanism. She paused. If the Vegas can document the water dispute and I can find someone who knows property water law, we might be able to challenge the delay in a different court. And if we can document the store pricing, you're talking about organizing half the valley, Roy said. I'm talking about the half that's left, Ilara said. Which is exactly what Blackwell wants to keep from happening. Caleb was very still. She knew she was pushing against something more than strategy. She was pushing against a man's fundamental operating principle, which was that you defended what was yours and you did it yourself, because relying on anyone else was how you ended up betrayed. He had built this ranch on that principle. He had survived on it. The idea of pooling resources, of making common cause, of trusting people who were not on his payroll to hold to an agreement, it ran against everything his experience had taught him. The families I talked to today, she said, more quietly. Martha Ellison's youngest daughter is 8 years old. If the Ellisons sell or fail, they have nowhere to go. Clara Vega's husband hasn't slept properly in 18 months because of that water dispute. These aren't strangers. They're your neighbors. And Blackwell is doing to all of them what he's doing to you, slowly, quietly. So it looks like weather and hard luck instead of what it is. Caleb looked at the table. A long time. Set up the meetings, he said. Which ones? All of them. He looked up at her. But I'm there. Every meeting. I'm not going to have them think this is your operation. It's your operation, she said. It was always your operation. I just do the thinking. Roy made the sound again that wasn't quite a laugh. Roy, Caleb said, without heat. Sir, Roy said, with approximately the same amount of heat, which was none. Elara got up from the table and got herself more coffee and stood at the stove for a moment, feeling the warmth of it and the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from the work of convincing people, which is a different muscle and leaves different bruises. She had been on this ranch for 3 weeks. She had not been sent away. She had not been welcomed, exactly, but she had made herself too useful to ignore. And there was a version of belonging that started there, in usefulness, in showing up and proving you understood something that mattered. It was not the version she would have chosen. She was not naive enough to think it was enough. But it was a start. And in her experience, starts were the part you had to survive before anything else could follow. The first joint meeting happened on a Wednesday, in the barn at the Voss Ranch because it was the largest enclosed space available that wasn't in town where Blackwell's people might notice an unusual gathering. Gene Ellison came. Antonio Vega came, with the expression of a man carrying a quiet fury he'd been holding for long enough that it had become part of his posture. Dale Pruitt came, big and slow-talking and skeptical in the way that ranchers from the territory often were, not stupid, but deeply distrustful of anything that looked like enthusiasm, because enthusiasm was what salesmen and con artists wore on their faces. A man named Forsyth came, whom Elara hadn't met, a widower who ran sheep rather than cattle, and who had been fighting a different but related battle with Blackwell over grazing rights. 5 operations. Between them, enough cattle to matter to a Miles City broker. Enough land to represent something Blackwell didn't fully control yet. Enough reason to be in a barn in the cold on a Wednesday evening, listening to a plan laid out by a woman most of them had never met, whose presence several of them were visibly uncertain about. Caleb introduced her as the person who saw the pattern. Not as his wife, she noticed the omission and understood it. In this room, among these men, wife was a word that would have closed doors before she'd opened them. The person who saw the pattern was something they could work with. She laid it out clearly. The Marsh pricing differential, the Blackwell store connections, the water dispute delay. She didn't editorialize. She just put the information in the room and let them see it. Pruitt said, "How do you know about Elwood in Miles City?" "My father represented him in a legal matter," Elara said. "He's reputable. He's hungry for Montana business. And he has no relationship with Blackwell." "That you know of," Pruitt said. "That I know of," she agreed. "Which is why we'd start with a trial sale. 1 season, a portion of each operation's cattle before anyone commits fully. The numbers either hold up or they don't." Pruitt chewed on this. Forsyth was looking at a point somewhere on the barn wall that seemed to be helping him think. Gene Ellison said, "If Blackwell figures out what we're doing, he'll figure it out eventually," Elara said. "The point is to have the structure in place before he does, so that when he pushes back, there's something solid enough to push back against." Caleb was standing slightly behind and to her left, and she was aware of his presence the way you're aware of a load-bearing wall. Not front and center, but structuring everything around it. He hadn't said much, but the men in the room were looking at him when she finished each point, and when he nodded, however slightly, she could see it land differently than her words alone would have. They didn't agree that night. That wasn't how it worked, with men like this. You didn't walk into their barn and walk out with signatures. You gave them something to think about and you waited. But they didn't say no, either. And Pruitt, leaving last, stopped at the barn door and looked at her with the expression of someone making a reluctant concession to evidence. "That fence on your East Creek," he said. "Martha told my wife about it. Said you figured out the repair and did half the work yourself." "We all did it," Elara said. "Caleb, Thomas, Miguel." Pruitt put his hat on. "You know what Blackwell calls women who try to do business in this territory?" "I can guess," Elara said. "He calls them someone else's problem," Pruitt said. "I thought you should know that's what you're up against." He went out into the cold. Elara stood in the barn and listened to the sound of his horse moving away, and felt the specific combination of anger and determination that had been her engine for most of her adult life. the thing that ran underneath everything and didn't quit when the surface of her was exhausted. Caleb was behind her. She hadn't heard him move. "He'll come around," he said. "I know," she said. "You handled that well." She turned. He was closer than she'd expected. Not inappropriately so, just the reduced distance that comes from standing in a barn in the dark when the social geometry of the room has simplified. His face in the lantern light was less guarded than usual, the way faces get when they've spent several hours watching something they didn't expect to see and the defenses have gotten tired. "I handled it the only way I know how," she said. "That's usually what well looks like," he said. He took the lantern and walked back toward the house, and she followed a few steps behind, and neither of them said anything else. And the silence between them had changed from the first day. It was still not comfortable exactly, but it was no longer hostile. It was the silence of two people who had not yet figured out what they were to each other, but had started, quietly and without announcement, to be something. Which was, in its own way, more frightening than the Blackwells and the Hendersons and all the ledgers full of bad numbers. But she was still here. Day 21. Still here, and the 90 days were no longer the only measure of time she was counting by. Pruitt came around on a Friday. He rode in without sending word ahead, which Alara had learned was how men in this territory signaled that something was serious. The casual arrival that was not casual at all. The hat held in the hands a little too carefully. The eyes that went to Caleb first, and then to her, in a way that acknowledged she was part of whatever conversation was about to happen, whether the old protocols approved of it or not. Caleb was at the table with his coffee when Pruitt knocked. Alara was at the desk with the ledger and the new correspondence from Elwood, who had written back with preliminary figures that were better than she'd hoped, and more specific than she'd asked for, which told her Elwood was hungry for the business in a way that would work in their favor. Pruitt sat down. Dottie poured without being asked, because Dottie understood the mechanics of difficult conversations and knew that something warm in a man's hands reduced the temperature of everything else. "Forsyth's out," Pruitt said. Caleb looked at him. "Why?" "Blackwell's man came to see him 2 days ago, offered to buy his grazing rights at a price that was, well, it was a real number, not what the land's worth, but real enough that a man with 3 kids and a wife who's been sick since August has to think about it." Pruitt turned his hat once. "Forsyth's thinking about it." The room was quiet. Outside, Thomas was doing something involving a bucket and a great deal of unnecessary noise that drifted in through the walls. "He hasn't signed," Alara said. "Not yet." "Then he's still thinkable," she said. Pruitt looked at her with the expression she'd seen on his face at the barn meeting, the reluctant recalibration of a man updating his estimate of something. "Maybe, but if Blackwell's making offers, it means he knows we've been talking, which means we've got less time than we thought." "How much less?" Caleb said. Pruitt shook his head. "I don't know. But I came here because if we're going to do something, we need to decide now, not next week, not after another meeting, now." Alara set down her pen. She had been running the numbers in her head since Pruitt walked in. Not the cattle numbers, the other numbers. Time, leverage. Who held what and how long they could hold it. "The trial sale with Elwood," she said. "If we move it up, if we send cattle in the next 2 weeks instead of waiting for spring, we establish the relationship before Blackwell can interfere with it. And we show Forsyth a real number, not a promise, an actual payment, in his hand, from a broker who isn't Marsh." 2 weeks is fast," Pruitt said. 2 weeks is what we have," she said. Caleb looked at her. Not the measuring look. The other one. The one that had started appearing in the last week, that she still hadn't fully cataloged because it was more complicated than the others, and she wasn't ready to look at it too directly. "How many head can we pull from our operation without hitting the spring count?" he asked her. Not Roy. Her. 40 to 45, she said. "If we pull from the north section where the grazing's been richest, they'll show well." Pruitt ran a hand over his jaw. "I can do 30 from mine, maybe 35. "Ellison?" "I'll go see Gene this afternoon," Pruitt said. "If he's in, that's close to 100 head. Enough for Elwood to take seriously." "He'll take it seriously," Alara said. "I'll write to him today." Pruitt looked at Caleb one more time, with the look of a man confirming something he'd already mostly decided. "She always like this?" he asked. "Apparently," Caleb said. Pruitt nodded slowly, settled his hat back on his head, and stood up. 2 weeks then. If Forsyth comes around, we bring him in. If he doesn't, he shrugged. We build around the gap. He went out. Alara was already pulling a fresh sheet of paper from the desk. Alara, Caleb said. She looked up. Good call, on the 2 weeks. He said it plainly, without decoration. Then he got up and went out to find Roy, because there was cattle to prepare and a timeline that had just compressed itself considerably, and he was a man who responded to urgency by moving rather than talking about it. She wrote the letter to Elwood. Her hand was steady. The rest of her was not entirely, but the hand was. And that was what made it onto the page. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest work Alara had done since arriving at the ranch. Not physically, though there was physical work, but the particular grinding labor of keeping multiple threads from snapping simultaneously while each one was being pulled from a different direction. Elwood wrote back within 4 days, which was fast enough to tell her he'd been waiting for a reason to move. He confirmed the sale terms and sent a contract that was clean and straightforward, and she noticed with satisfaction contained no clauses that gave him unusual control over future pricing. Something Marcia's original agreement with Caleb had apparently included buried in the second page, which she'd found when she'd gone back through the ledger looking for the original terms. She showed that clause to Caleb. He read it twice. His jaw tightened in the specific way it did when he was absorbing something he wished he'd caught himself. I should have read it more carefully, he said. Your father signed the original agreement with Marsh, she said. She'd figured this out from the dates, the second handwriting in the ledger, the one that stopped in 1879. You inherited the arrangement. He was quiet for a moment. He trusted people, he said, in a voice that didn't tell her whether he thought that was a virtue or a flaw. So do you, she said. You just trust fewer of them. He looked at her. Is that a criticism? It's an observation, she said. Useful, sometimes. Costly, others. He didn't argue with that. Instead, he said, What else did you find in there that I should know about? It was the question she'd been waiting for him to ask, and the fact that he asked it, directly, without defensiveness, accepting that she'd seen things in his own records that he'd missed, told her something important about where they were now versus where they'd started. A month ago, he'd told her not to tell him how to talk to a man. Today, he was asking her what she'd found. People move slowly, in her experience, and then all at once. Nothing else immediate, she said. But we should restructure how the accounts are kept going forward. I can show you a system that makes the pricing patterns visible earlier, so this kind of thing can't hide in the numbers as long. Show me, he said. And they sat at the table for 2 hours while she walked him through it, and he asked questions that were sharp and practical and occasionally revealed that he understood more about finance than he'd let on. He'd just never had it organized in a way that let him use what he knew. By the end of it, they were both leaning over the same page, and at some point the distance between them at the table had reduced to something she hadn't noticed until she noticed it. She sat back. He sat back. Neither of them said anything about it. Gene Ellison agreed to join the trial sale. He came himself, without Pruitt, riding over on a Thursday morning with his hat pulled low and his expression set in the manner of a man who has made a decision he's committed to and is not going to revisit it, so nobody should bother trying. He shook Caleb's hand. Then he looked at Alara. Martha says you're the one who came up with this, he said. Caleb and I worked it out together, Alara said. Ellison's mouth compressed slightly. Not disagreement, she thought, just the expression of a man who recognized diplomatic language and appreciated it even while seeing through it. Martha also says your East Creek fence has been holding since October and you haven't bought hay from Billings Crossing since. That's right. He nodded. She wants to know if you'd come for dinner sometime. She doesn't have many... He stopped, chose his word. Neighbors. It was a carefully constructed sentence, that one. Not women, though that was what he meant. Neighbors. The word that made it about geography rather than gender, which was either courtesy or a kind of small courage, and Alara decided to receive it as both. I'd like that very much, she said. Ellison nodded again, with the air of a man who had accomplished a secondary mission he'd brought along and could now focus on the primary one. He and Caleb spent the rest of the morning going over the cattle selection for the sale, and Alara stayed out of it because this was a conversation between two men about their animals and their land, and it didn't need her, and knowing when you didn't need to be somewhere was as important as knowing when you did. She spent that morning instead with Clara Vega, who had ridden over with a folder of documents related to the water rights dispute, legal filings, survey records, the correspondence with the county judge that had been going nowhere for 18 months. Alara read through them carefully, and what she found was both infuriating and, in a specific way, useful. The judge wasn't corrupt exactly. That would have been simpler. He was cautious, the kind of judicial caution that looks like impartiality but is really risk avoidance. A man who didn't want to rule against Blackwell because Blackwell had resources and the ability to make a judge's professional life complicated. He kept scheduling delays. He kept asking for additional documentation. He kept finding procedural reasons to avoid the substantive question. The documentation he's asking for, Alara said, spreading the most recent request across the table. The upstream survey of Blackwell's property. Does Blackwell have to provide it, or do you? Clara looked at the document. He keeps saying it's our obligation to. It isn't, Alara said. The burden of proving a change in water allocation is on the party claiming the change. That's Blackwell. He's the one asserting that his upstream property affects your rights. Your lawyer should have pushed back on this. Clara was quiet for a moment. Our lawyer is in Billings. He does what he can, but he doesn't. She stopped. He's a little afraid of Blackwell's people. Alara thought about her father, about the 3 hours in his office when she'd said what she thought and it hadn't mattered, about all the rooms she'd been in where people who were technically capable of doing the right thing had found reasons not to, and the particular exhaustion of watching it happen and being told it was just how things worked. There's an attorney in Miles City, she said. Elwood mentioned him. He handles land and water cases in the territory. I can write to him. No obligation, just to understand the options. Clara looked at her with an expression that was equal parts hope and the wariness that comes from having hoped before and been disappointed. Why are you doing all this? She said. You've been here 2 months. You don't owe these families anything. Alara considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. Because Blackwell is counting on everyone staying separate, she said. He's counting on Gene Ellison thinking his problem is different from yours, and yours being different from Pruitt's, and none of you talking to each other. The moment people start seeing the same pattern, his whole system gets harder to maintain. She paused. And because Martha Ellison's daughter is 8 years old and deserves to still be on her family's land when she's 18. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she put the documents back in the folder and slid them across the table. Write the letter, she said. The cattle drive to the Miles City railhead was a 3-day trip, and Caleb led it himself with Roy and 2 of the hands. Alara stayed at the ranch because someone had to, and because 97 head of cattle moving across winter terrain required every experienced rider they had. She did not argue about staying. She understood logistics. What she did not anticipate was how different the ranch felt with Caleb gone. It was not that she couldn't manage it. She could, and did. And Thomas turned out to be more capable than he appeared when there was no one senior around for him to defer to. It was something quieter than management. The house had a different weight to it in the evenings. She found herself looking up from the ledger at the sound of a horse and being briefly, absurdly certain it would be him, and then it wouldn't be. She did not examine this feeling carefully. She had enough to do. On the second evening, a rider came from Billings Crossing with a message. Not for her, for Caleb, which meant she had to decide whether to open it. She held it for a while, then opened it. It was from a man named Carver, whose name she recognized from Roy's mention of him as one of Blackwell's local managers. The message was short. It said, "Tell Voss that the offer stands at $9,000 for the full property. It won't be made again." $9,000. The Voss ranch, the land, the cattle, the buildings, everything, for a property that was worth, by her calculation, closer to $14,000 in a fair market, and which would be worth significantly more if the Elwood arrangement held and the east section was properly developed. $9,000 was an insult dressed up as generosity. She put the message on the table and looked at it for a while. Then she picked up a pen and wrote the number down on a separate piece of paper, along with the date and Carver's name and the wording, "Offer will not be made again," because a threat with a deadline was a piece of information, and information needed to be recorded. When Caleb came back on the 4th day, a day late because one of the steers had gone lame on the second morning and slowed the whole drive, He came through the door looking like a man who had spent 3 days outside in Montana in November, which was to say, tired in the specific layered way that cold and movement and responsibility produce. He smelled like cattle and wood smoke, and the particular outdoorsness of someone who had not been near a stove for several days. He sat down in the chair at the table, and Alara put coffee in front of him and then put the note from Carver beside the coffee. He read it. His face did the thing. The stillness. When did this come? 2 days ago. Why didn't you... He stopped. You couldn't reach me. No, she said. I wrote down everything that was in the message verbatim, the date and the writer's description. It's in the ledger. She sat down across from him. Elwood paid? Caleb looked up from the note. The tiredness in his face shifted into something else. Paid at Ellison's terms and ours. Better than Marsh's figures by 18%. 18%. She had estimated 15, which meant Elwood was even more motivated for their business than she'd calculated. And the others? Ellison and Pruitt? They got their cuts. Pruitt didn't say much. Ellison... Caleb's mouth curved slightly. Ellison shook my hand twice. Once when the payment came through and once when we were leaving. Looked like a man who'd been holding his breath for a year. She thought about Gene Ellison and his 8-year-old daughter and said nothing. Just let it be what it was. Blackwell knows, Caleb said, looking at the note again. He knew before the drive, probably before Pruitt came here. He's been watching. She paused. The 9,000 is a message. He's saying he can still make this go away if you're willing to take the money and leave. I'm not willing. I know. But his next move won't be an offer. She held his gaze. He's going to push harder. I don't know the form it takes yet, but it's coming. Caleb set down the coffee, looked at the table, looked at her. You're not scared, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was closer to an observation with a question inside it. I'm scared, she said. I'm just not stopping. The distinction seemed to land somewhere in him. He didn't say anything else about it, just picked up the coffee again, and they sat in the particular quiet of two people who have arrived, without quite planning it, at a point where the same things matter to both of them. The first act of retaliation came 11 days later. Roy found it in the morning. 3 sections of the newly repaired East Creek fence cut clean through, the posts pulled and thrown into the creek itself. Not weather, not accident. The cuts were made at night, deliberately, by someone who knew exactly what that fence repair had cost and wanted it to cost again. Caleb stood at the edge of the damage with his jaw set and said nothing for a long time. Alara stood beside him. He's trying to make us spend labor and materials, she said. Every hour we spend repairing this is an hour we're not doing something else. Every supply purchase stretches the operating budget. I know what he's doing, Caleb said. Then you know that fixing the fence is only part of the response. He looked at her. What's the other part? Documentation. Every act of sabotage, written down with dates, physical description, water rights case goes to the right attorney, and when we bring what we know about Marsh's pricing to a territorial court, we need a pattern of behavior on record. A man doesn't destroy fences once. He does it until someone makes it more expensive to continue than to stop. Roy was crouching by one of the cut posts, examining the cut. This was made with a bolt cutter, he said. Specific tool. Someone planned this. Can you identify the bolt cutter? Alara asked. Roy looked at her. Not from a cut mark. But you'd know it if you saw it? Roy stood, looked at Caleb. Possibly. Blackwell's men have to get their equipment somewhere, she said. General store in Billings Crossing is Blackwell's, but hardware for the kind of work his ranch operation does. For a big operation, you order in volume. From a supplier. That supplier has records. Caleb was very still. You want to pull supply records. I want to know who ordered what and when. It won't prove who cut our fence, but it establishes the capacity and the pattern. She paused. And it gives us something to bring to a court that isn't just a rancher saying another rancher is causing trouble. You sound like a lawyer, Roy said. There was nothing negative in it. If anything, there was something that might have been admiration operating behind a careful wall of neutrality. My father was one, she said. I spent 15 years watching how evidence worked and didn't work. The problem was never that people didn't have the truth. It was that they didn't have the truth in a form a court could use. Caleb looked at the ruined fence. at the post thrown in the creek, at the cold, clean evidence of someone who considered this property an obstacle rather than a home. Fix the fence, he told Roy. Same materials, same design. Then to Alara, write down everything from the beginning, the marsh figures, the Carver note, the fence sections, the dates, everything you know about the Vega water dispute, all of it. I've already started, she said. He looked at her. How long ago? The day after you brought the ledger to the table, she said. I didn't know what shape it would take, but I knew we'd need a record at some point. He said nothing for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, and she followed, and Roy began the grim business of retrieving fence posts from a half-frozen creek. It was Forsyth who came back. Not to join them. Not yet. He came on a Tuesday evening when the light was already going, riding up to the porch with the uncertain manner of a man who has been arguing with himself for long enough that he's stopped enjoying it and just wants the argument to be over. Caleb and Alara were on the porch. They'd been going over the documentation she'd assembled. She'd organized it into sections, chronological within each category, the kind of structure her father had used for case files because judges and lawyers and anyone else who needed to be persuaded needed to be able to find things quickly. Caleb had been reading through it with the focused attention he gave to anything he'd decided was worth understanding. Forsyth dismounted, stood with his hat in his hands. My wife's better, he said. Fever broke last week. He said it to Caleb, but his eyes went to Alara in the way that meant the statement was also partly for her. Glad to hear it, Caleb said. Blackwell's man came back, Forsyth said. Raised the offer. He named a number that was higher than the first one. Still not what the land was worth, but higher. And he said, Forsyth stopped. His jaw worked. He said if I didn't take it this time, the next conversation would be with my lawyer, not with me. Alara set down the papers quietly. That's a threat, Caleb said. Yes, Forsyth said. It is. What kind of legal claim does he have against your property? Alara asked. Forsyth looked at her. He says there's a disputed boundary survey from 1878. He says my east pasture, the one I've been running sheep on for 12 years, actually falls inside his original land grant. Has he produced the survey? His man said they had it. Has he produced it? She said again. Forsyth's brow furrowed. No, he said he doesn't have it, she said. Or if he has something, it's been altered or misrepresented, because a genuine survey dispute would have come with documentation at the first offer, not held back as a threat for the second one. She looked at him steadily. He's trying to frighten you into selling before you have time to look at what he actually has. Forsyth was quiet. Behind him, his horse shifted its weight in the way horses do when they're cold and would prefer to be somewhere warmer. If you have the original documentation from your land grant, Alara said, I'd like to see it, not to make decisions for you. That's yours to make. But I've been building a record of everything Blackwell's done in this valley, and a false boundary claim would be part of that pattern. Forsyth looked at Caleb. The look of a man checking whether the institution he knew, the male one, the rancher-to-rancher one, was endorsing what the woman beside him had just said. Caleb said, She's asking the right questions. Forsyth looked back at Alara, nodded once, slowly. I have the original grant papers. My father filed them in 71. He put his hat back on. I'll bring them by the end of the week. He mounted and rode out. The dark came down fully and the porch got cold. He's going to come in with us, Caleb said. Yes, Alara said. You knew the survey thing was bluff. I suspected it. The timing was the tell. Real legal claims lead with evidence. Blackwell's working with fear because the evidence isn't what he needs it to be. She gathered the papers from the porch railing before the wind could take them. But we'll know more when we see Forsyth's grant documents. They went inside. Dottie had left soup on the stove. She'd started doing this, leaving food even on her non-days, a small quiet act of investment in whatever was happening at this ranch that she approved of without saying so directly. Alara served it, and they ate, and the house was warm. You wrote to the Miles City attorney, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen the outgoing letter. 2 weeks ago, she said. He wrote back. He thinks the Vega case has merit, and he's willing to take it on contingency, which means Antonio Vega doesn't have to pay unless they win. She hesitated. He also said that if we have documented evidence of a coordinated pattern of business interference, pricing manipulation, false legal claims, property sabotage, there's a territorial statute that covers it. It's not commonly applied, but it exists. Caleb set down his spoon. What does it cover? Criminal interference with commerce, she said. It was written for railroads, to prevent large operators from using illegal methods to squeeze out competitors. It's never been used against a cattle operation, but the language is broad enough. You think it applies? I think if we have the documentation and the right attorney makes the argument, a territorial judge might agree that it applies. She looked at him directly. It wouldn't be fast, and Blackwell would fight it, but it would change the nature of what we're doing, from defending individual properties to establishing that what he's done is illegal. That's a different thing entirely. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the soup went from hot to warm and the stove settled into its evening sounds. My father built this ranch, he said. Not loudly. The way people say things that matter, in a register just above silence. He came here in 1861 with $400 and a wagon and 2 horses. He broke this ground himself. He built that barn board by board. He stopped. When he died, I swore I wasn't going to lose it. I didn't care what it cost. She waited. I nearly lost it anyway, he said. Not because I didn't work hard enough. Because I was fighting the wrong battle. Defending fence lines when the real attack was coming through the ledger. You didn't have someone looking at the ledger, she said. He looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the holding pattern, not the measuring look, but something more open than that. Something that was the expression underneath those expressions when the defenses weren't operating at full capacity. No, he said. I didn't. It was quiet for a moment. The stove, the wind outside doing its winter business against the walls. Caleb, she said. It was the first time she'd used his name without a practical purpose attached to it, and they both registered it. What happened to the second handwriting in the ledger, the one that stops in 1879? He looked at the table. My wife, he said. Her name was Mary. She kept the books because she was better at it than I was. He said it plainly, without obvious grief, but with the specific flatness of a pain that has been lived with long enough to become part of the architecture. She died in the spring of '79. Fever. I'm sorry, Alara said. It was a long time ago. That doesn't always matter, she said. He looked at her, and this time whatever was in his face stayed there a moment longer before he put it away. No, he said. It doesn't. They didn't say anything else that night. But something had shifted, the way things shift when 2 people say true things to each other in a warm room in the winter, and the shift was the kind that doesn't shift back. The storm came in the 3rd week of December, and it came fast. Montana storms in December were not unusual, but this one was the kind that the old-timers described with a particular word. Not blizzard, which was a tourist term, but a blow. A total aggressive rearrangement of the world by wind and snow and cold, operating in concert with each other. It came down from the north with almost no warning, and it hit the valley like something that had been saving itself up. Alara was at the Ellison property when it started. She had ridden over in the morning to help Martha Ellison review the Forsyth land grant documents, which Forsyth had brought by as promised, and which she'd wanted a second set of eyes on. Martha had a practical intelligence she'd learned to trust, and 2 people reading a legal document were better than one. She'd planned to ride back before noon. By 10 in the morning, the sky had gone the particular greenish-white that meant serious weather, and by 11 she knew she wasn't riding back in it. Martha Ellison took the decision out of her hands. You're staying, she said, in the tone of a woman who has made arrangements and is informing you of them, not requesting your input. Alara sent the Ellisons' youngest hand back to the Voss Ranch with a message. She did not love sending him into worsening weather, but the alternative was Caleb not knowing where she was, and she had a specific and practical understanding of how bad that outcome would be. The hand made it. He came back 2 hours later with a return message from Caleb that said, Stay there. Don't ride in this. CV, 4 words, and his initials. She folded the message and put it in her coat pocket and went to help Martha with the shutters. What she didn't know, because she wasn't there, was what Caleb was dealing with at the same time. She found out later, from Roy, from Thomas, from the pieces that came together over the following days, that the storm had caught a portion of the Voss cattle and the Pruitt cattle in the South Valley where the temperature dropped fastest, and that Caleb had gone out into it. Not because it was rational, because it wasn't, but because the cattle were there and the cold was killing them, and he was the kind of man who could not stand at a window and watch something he was responsible for die if there was any possibility he could prevent it. Roy went with him. Thomas went, even though Caleb told him not to, because Thomas was the kind of young man who took "don't follow me" as a logistical challenge rather than an instruction. They got the cattle out. Not all of them. They lost 11 head in the storm, which was real money and real pain. But they got the majority of them moved to the barn in the covered sections before the worst of it hit. Pruitt's foreman came out from the east in the middle of it, having made the same calculation Caleb made about his employer's cattle, and they worked alongside each other in the dark and the wind without ceremony or introduction, two groups of men doing the same necessary thing. When the storm broke on the second day, Elara rode back. The road was bad. The horse didn't like it, and communicated this through a series of increasingly pointed objections, but she pushed through and made the ranch by mid-morning. The yard was covered. The barn doors were open and she could see hay and cattle inside and hear the particular sound of a barn functioning at overcapacity, every warm space occupied by animals that had been brought in from the cold. Caleb was in the barn. He had ice in his beard and his coat was still wet from the night before, and he was moving slowly in a way she recognized as the movement of someone running on the reserves behind the reserves. The machinery still going, because stopping was a decision that hadn't been made yet rather than because there was anything left in the tank. He saw her, and something in his face did what faces do when a thing that was worried becomes unworried, a specific restructuring around the eyes and jaw. That was not a smile, but was the thing that happens before a smile in people who don't smile easily. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right," she said. "The Ellisons put me up. Their roof holds." She looked at the barn, at the cattle. "You went out." "Had to." "How many did we lose?" 11. 8 hours, 3 Pruitts. She did the arithmetic automatically, the way she always did. Not good, not catastrophic. "The ones we saved?" "Well over 100 between us. And Pruitt's man—" He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. "They came out from the east in the worst of it. Didn't have to." "Pruitt's people came to help Voss cattle," she said. "And the other way around," he said. She stood in the barn door and understood what this meant. Not just the practical meaning, the cattle saved and the cost shared, but the other meaning. The thing she'd been trying to build from paper and letters and ledger entries and barn meetings had been tested by a storm that didn't care about alliances or plans, and it had held. People had come out of their own warmth and into danger because there was a network now, a thing between these ranches that was more than each of them alone. And when something threatened one part of it, the other parts responded. This was what Blackwell had been trying to prevent. Not any individual rancher getting stronger. This. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. He was tired past the point of the careful face. The face that held everything at arm's length was simply not available right now. And what was underneath it was a man who had spent 2 days in a Montana storm trying to save what he'd built, and who was standing in his barn looking at her with something that required more honesty than he usually permitted himself. "You should sleep," she said. "There's still—" "Roy can do the rest of it," she said. "Thomas can do the rest of it. You need to sleep." She held his gaze. "The ranch will still be here when you wake up, because of what you did last night." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and walked past her toward the house, and she followed, and the cold came in off the yard, and she let it, because after 2 days at the Ellisons and a hard ride home through drifted snow, she didn't mind it. In the house she put coffee on, and he sat at the table and was asleep before it was ready, head down on his arms in the chair like a man who has simply run out of the ability to do anything other than this. She covered his shoulders with the blanket from the hook by the door, and let him sleep and drank the coffee herself. Standing at the window looking out at the yard and the barn and the land that had been his father's and was now his and was now, in some way that neither of them had agreed to formally, and neither of them was pretending wasn't true, beginning to be hers as well. Outside, the storm's evidence lay in every direction. The drifts against the fence, the tracks in the snow from the night's hard work, the sky still gray and cold but no longer threatening, having said what it came to say and moved on. 11 had lost, 100 and more saved, an alliance tested and intact, and a man asleep in a chair who had not once, in all of it, told her she didn't belong here. She thought that was worth something. She thought it might be worth quite a lot. Caleb slept for 4 hours and woke up angry, not at anything specific, or rather, at everything that had been accumulating since the storm hit and hadn't had a clean outlet yet. He came out of the chair with the blanket still on his shoulders and looked at it like it had done something suspicious, then looked at Alara, who was at the desk going through the Forsyth land grant documents she'd brought back from the Ellisons wrapped in oilcloth inside her coat. "You didn't wake me," he said. "You needed the sleep." "I needed to check the north pasture line." "Roy checked it an hour ago. 2 sections down, repairable. He's already started." She didn't look up from the documents. "The cattle in the east barn are settled. Thomas fed them. Miguel found a break in the water trough line and fixed it without being asked." Caleb stood in the middle of the room with the blanket around his shoulders, like a man who had arrived ready for an argument and found all the arguments had been resolved while he was unconscious. He dropped the blanket on the chair. "You organized all that," he said. "They knew what needed doing," she said. "I just told them you'd approved it." "I was asleep." "You would have approved it," she said. He looked at her. She looked up from the Forsyth papers. For a moment, the room held the particular tension of 2 people deciding simultaneously whether the moment was going to become a confrontation or something else. It became something else. Caleb sat down across from her and pulled the blanket back around his shoulders because the room was cold and his coat was still damp on the hook, and said, "What are those?" "Forsyth's land grant from 1871. She turned the papers so he could see. "The boundary Blackwell claims is disputed. It's here, the east pasture line. But the original survey is clear. The land was properly recorded and the coordinates are specific. Blackwell's claim would require the original survey to be wrong, which would mean the county recorder's records are wrong, which means he'd need to prove either surveyor error or fraud. Can he prove it? Not with documents that exist, which is why his man threatened rather than filed." She set the papers down. "But here's the thing. I found something else in here. The original Forsyth grant abuts a water easement that was recorded the same year, giving the Forsyth property downstream access from the North Creek. That creek runs through Blackwell's acquired land." Caleb was fully awake now, the sleep-blurred edges gone. "Blackwell's been blocking that easement. Blackwell may not even know the easement exists, or he's hoping Forsyth doesn't. It's in the original recording documents, and it's never been challenged because it's never needed to be used. Forsyth has his own well and hasn't touched the creek access in years." She paused. "But a recorded easement doesn't expire because you don't use it. And if Blackwell is making legal threats against Forsyth's east pasture, Forsyth has a legitimate counterclaim that goes right back upstream." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You found this morning." "I found it yesterday at the Ellisons. Martha was the one who noticed the easement language. She saw it because she'd been reading the Vega water rights documents, and the legal phrasing was similar." He looked at the papers, then at her. "Martha Ellison." "She's sharper than people give her credit for," Alara said. "Most women are." He absorbed this without comment, which she'd learned to read as agreement he wasn't quite ready to say out loud. "Send for Forsyth," he said. "I already wrote the note. Thomas will write it over this afternoon when the road's clear enough." Caleb put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. "You do that a lot," he said. "Start things before I've told you to." "Is that a problem?" He thought about it, actually thought about it, in the honest way he'd been increasingly willing to think about things since the ledger conversation, since the fence repair, since the slow accumulation of days that had changed the nature of what they were doing here. "It was," he said. "It's getting less so." It was not a declaration. It was a man updating a position, slowly, the way he did everything, without flourish, without announcement, just a quiet shift in the weight of how he stood. She received it as what it was. "The Miles City attorney," she said. "He needs the full documentation by the end of January if he's going to file before the spring court session. That means I need to finish compiling everything in the next 2 weeks. What else do you need?" "A statement from you about the marsh pricing, written, signed, specific dates and figures. Roy's account of the fence sabotage incidents, same format. And anything you remember from before 1879. Any conversations with your father about Blackwell, or the people who became Blackwell's people, even informal. Context matters. He nodded. I'll write the statement tonight. And Roy? I'll talk to Roy. He stood, and the blanket fell off his shoulders again, and he picked up his still damp coat from the hook, because apparently 4 hours of sleep was sufficient, and the north pasture fence wasn't going to supervise itself. He stopped at the door. The easement. If it holds up, it gives Forsyth leverage, she said, and it gives the attorney a second front. Blackwell can't sue Forsyth for the east pasture boundary, while Forsyth has a valid counterclaim on the water easement. One of them has to give. Blackwell doesn't give, Caleb said. Then he fights on 2 fronts with documentation on neither side, she said. That's a different kind of pressure than he's used to. Caleb went out. She heard him in the yard talking to Roy in the short sentence way they had with each other, then the sound of horses, then quiet. She picked up her pen and went back to the compilation, and the house settled around her into its working sounds. The stove, the wind finishing what was left of itself, the distant cattle in the barn, and she sat in it and felt, for the first time since the storm, that the ground was solid again. Forsyth came 2 days later and sat at the same table where all the significant conversations seemed to happen, and Alara showed him the easement language and watched his face move through several stages: confusion, then careful attention, then the slow dawning of a man who realizes he has been holding a card for 12 years without knowing it was in his hand. My father never mentioned this, Forsyth said. He may not have known it would matter, Alara said. When he recorded the grant, Blackwell didn't own the upstream land. The easement was protective language that seemed theoretical. Forsyth read the relevant section again, his lips moving slightly. Then he set the document down. If I file this with the Miles City attorney, it becomes part of the record, Alara said, which means any legal action Blackwell takes against your east pasture has to contend with an existing documented right that predates his ownership of the upstream property. Forsyth looked at Caleb, who was at the far end of the table with his coffee, present, but not leading this. Deliberately, she understood. He'd positioned himself there on purpose, letting her handle it, which 3 months ago would have been impossible to imagine. I'm in, Forsyth said. Whatever you need from me. A signed statement about the threats you received, Alara said. The specific language Blackwell's man used. The next conversation would be with your lawyer. That's an implicit threat to pursue false legal action, and it belongs in the record. She slid a sheet of paper across the table. I've drafted a framework. You fill in what you remember, as specifically as you can. Dates, names, exact words. Forsyth picked up the pen. His hand was steadier than she might have expected, for a man whose wife had just been sick and whose land had been under threat for months. Some people, she'd found, steadied when they finally had something concrete to do with the fear they'd been carrying. While Forsyth wrote, Caleb caught her eye across the table. He tilted his head slightly toward the door. Not a summons, more a question. She nodded. They went out to the porch. The cold was sharp and clean after the storm, the kind of January air that made everything feel very clear and very close. Blackwell's going to come back harder, Caleb said. Once the attorney files, he'll know we've got something. I know. He has money we don't have. He can draw this out for years if he wants. He can, she said. But drawing it out costs him too. Legal fees, time. And every month the Elwood arrangement holds, we're cutting into what he built with the marsh pricing. He's losing revenue from the mechanism he used to starve the valley while spending money fighting a legal battle on 2 fronts. She looked out at the yard, the snow still deep along the fence lines. He's not used to people who can think ahead of him. That's his real vulnerability. And you can, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. He'd stopped phrasing things about her as questions several weeks ago. I can try, she said. I make mistakes. Name one, he said. The directness of it surprised her. Not challenging, genuinely curious. She thought about it honestly. The first week. I asked Miguel about the fence repair before I came to you. That was wrong. It was your ranch and your men, and I went around you out of impatience, not necessity. He nodded slowly. I remember. I've tried not to do it since. You haven't, he said. Not once. The acknowledgement was plain and quiet, the way he gave credit for things, without frame or emphasis, just the thing itself laid down in the air between them. She had learned to receive it that way. There's something else, she said. Tell me. She turned to face him directly, which was a thing she did when she needed him to understand she wasn't managing how something landed. She was just saying it straight. The legal case is going to require a clear statement of the marriage arrangement. The attorney asked about it in his last letter. The contract, the terms, the cohabitation clause. Because if Blackwell tries to challenge our standing to file jointly, the nature of our arrangement will come up. She paused. I want you to know that ahead of time, before the attorney knows, before it becomes something someone else defines. Caleb was very still. The way he was still when he was thinking, not suppressing. What are you saying? He said. I'm saying the contract we have is not a marriage in any real sense. It's a 90-day residence agreement that expired 6 weeks ago, which we've both ignored because neither of us raised it. She held his gaze. Blackwell's lawyers will find it. If they can argue our joint filing lacks legal standing because we're not actually married, they'll use it. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked out at the yard, at the barn, at the fence lines that had been cut and repaired and cut again and repaired again. What does the attorney say we should do? He said. He didn't say should, she said. He said the standing question would be straightforward if our arrangement were formalized. Formalized, Caleb said. Yes. Another long pause. The cold worked at both of them with the patient indifference of Montana January. Is that something you want, he said, or something that's strategically necessary? It was the most direct personal question he had ever asked her, and he asked it looking at the barn rather than at her, which was either cowardice or the opposite, a way of giving her the space to answer without the weight of his face on the answer. Both, she said, honestly, and I'd rather say both than pretend it's only one. He turned and looked at her then, the face without the defenses, the one she'd started seeing more of since December, since the storm, since the chair, since two people saying true things to each other in a warm room at night. All right, he said. All right, which part? She said. All of it, he said. Both. They stood on the porch in the January cold, and it was not a romantic scene. They were both wearing work coats, and her boots were still damp from the morning, and he had hay in his hair from the barn. But it was real in the way that real things are real, without decoration, exactly what it was, and nothing more than that, which was enough. Inside, Forsyth was still writing his statement. The stove was going. There was work to do. They went back inside. January became February in the way. Montana months do. Not a turning so much as a continuation of the same argument the weather had been making since November, just with slightly different vocabulary. The cold held. The alliance held with it. The Miles City attorney, his name was Darrow, Henry Darrow, a spare, methodical man whose letters communicated volumes through what they didn't bother to say, filed the initial documentation in the third week of January as promised. He filed 3 things simultaneously: the Vega water rights appeal with the augmented argument about burden of proof, the Forsyth easement counterclaim against Blackwell's boundary threat, and a formal inquiry to the Territorial Commerce Office about the marsh pricing differential and its relationship to coordinated business suppression. He sent Alara a copy of each filing and a short note that said, "The response from the opposing party will be instructive. Give it 2 weeks." It took 10 days. Blackwell's response came not through the courts, but through the town, which was how she'd expected it. Roy came back from Billings Crossing on a Wednesday with his face set in the particular arrangement that meant he'd heard something he didn't want to report. "People are talking," he said at the table, with Caleb and Alara both present, because that was how things worked now, and Roy had stopped directing conversation to Caleb with the implicit asterisk of, "and the woman can listen." "Talking about what?" Caleb said. "About the filings, about the alliance, about—" Roy stopped, set his hat on the table. "About Mrs. Voss." Alara said, "What are they saying?" "That you're an Eastern woman who came here to cause trouble. That the legal filings are your idea, and Caleb's been manipulated into them. That you don't understand how things work in the territory." Roy's jaw tightened. "Carver was in the store. He was saying it loud enough to be heard." "He was saying it loud enough to be repeated," Alara said. "That's the point." "He said—" Roy looked at Caleb. Something passed between them. "Roy," Caleb said. "He said that Caleb Voss used to be a man who knew his own mind, before he let a wife who couldn't find a proper husband back east make his decisions for him." Roy said it flatly, without editorial, the way you deliver something unpleasant by not dressing it up. He said it where Gene Ellison could hear it. The kitchen was quiet. Alara was aware of both men watching her, gauging. "What did Ellison say?" she asked. Roy looked slightly surprised by the question. He'd been watching for anger or hurt, and she'd given him neither. He said that any man who let his neighbors get robbed for 4 years while he was too proud to admit it was a problem maybe shouldn't be commenting on other people's decision-making. Something shifted in Caleb's face. Not visibly, but she could see it now, the small adjustments, and she'd learned to read them. "Ellison said that," Caleb said. "In the general store. Carver left." Roy's mouth curved slightly. Martha Ellison was with him. She apparently said something as well, but Ellison said he couldn't repeat it in mixed company. Despite everything, despite the cold calculation of what Blackwell was doing and the seriousness of what was coming, Alara felt something loosen in her chest. Martha Ellison and her careful hospitality, and her 8-year-old daughter and her sharper-than-credited mind, standing in a general store in Billings Crossing and saying something unrepeatable to the man sent to undermine the alliance. "The attacks on your reputation will keep coming," she said to Caleb. "Blackwell's trying to separate you from the alliance by suggesting you've been weakened by association with me. If it works," the other ranchers step back. "The joint filing loses its force." "It won't work," Caleb said. "You should know it's going to get worse before—" "Alara." He said her name the way he'd been saying it recently. Not a summons, not a correction, just a signal of direct attention. "It won't work." She looked at him. He held the look the way he'd started to hold things, steadily, without the old reflex to let the gaze slide away before it revealed too much. "All right," she said. Roy picked up his hat. "I'll be in the barn," he said, in the tone of a man who has completed his report and is exercising discretion about how long he remains in the room. He went. Alara got up and refilled both coffee cups and sat back down, and they were quiet for a moment with the sound of the stove between them. "He's escalating because the filing scared him," she said. "Reputational attacks are cheaper than legal ones, and they don't leave a paper trail. He's hoping to collapse the coalition through gossip before Darrow gets any traction." "How long does Darrow need?" Caleb said. "For the Commerce inquiry, possibly months. The water rights case and the Forsyth counterclaim. Darrow thinks the Forsyth one could move faster because the easement documentation is clean, and the counterclaim essentially stops Blackwell's threat in its tracks." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "The Commerce inquiry is the one that matters most. If the Territorial Office agrees there's a case for coordinated suppression, it changes the entire scope. It stops being 5 ranchers fighting one powerful man and starts being a territorial matter." "Which is where he loses control of it," Caleb said. "Which is where he loses control of it," she confirmed. He nodded. Then, after a pause, "The ceremony was plain." She looked at him. "The ceremony," he said, with the slight roughness of a man navigating unfamiliar conversational terrain. "At the Justice of the Peace in January, it was— I know it wasn't—" He stopped, tried again. "You didn't have a ring. I should have had a ring." They had gone to the Justice of the Peace on a Tuesday morning with Roy and Dottie as witnesses, in their regular clothes because neither of them owned anything impractical, and it had taken 11 minutes, and they had ridden back to the ranch, and Roy had made a comment about the weather, and Dottie had made a cake that was slightly lopsided and altogether excellent. "I didn't need a ring," she said. "Maybe not, but I should have—" He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "My mother's ring is in the box in the bedroom, top shelf. I should have offered it before." She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you?" He looked at the table. "Because offering it felt like saying something I wasn't sure how to say yet." He paused. "I'm saying it now." She understood because she'd had her own version of the same hesitation, the gap between what was true and what she was ready to claim. A man who had lost one wife and spent 4 years building a wall and then watched a woman he never asked for dismantle it. One practical decision at a time, standing in his own kitchen, telling her that she should have had his mother's ring. It was not a speech. It was just the truth of it, offered plainly. "Then I'll wear it," she said. He got up from the table and went to the bedroom and came back with a small box that had clearly not been opened in a long time. The hinge was stiff, and he worked it open with a patience that she recognized as the same patience he brought to broken things that mattered. Inside was a ring that was simple and worn and real, the kind of thing made to be used rather than displayed. He set it on the table in front of her. He did not put it on her hand. She didn't expect him to, understood that this was him delivering something and her choosing to receive it, and the choice was the important part. She picked it up, put it on. It fit, which seemed either like luck or like the universe making a minor editorial point. And she was not superstitious enough to read too much into it, but she registered it. "Your mother's name?" she said. "Catherine," he said. "Kate." "She must have been practical," Alara said. "It's a practical ring." "She was the most practical person I ever knew," he said. "Until recently." She looked up at him. He was standing at the edge of the table with the empty box in his hands and his face doing the open thing. The thing she'd stopped finding surprising and started finding familiar. The face under the face. "I'll try to be worth it," she said. "You already are," he said. He said it quickly, almost before she finished the sentence, and then looked slightly as if he hadn't planned to say it quite that fast. She didn't make him account for it. She just let it sit in the air between them as the true thing it was. The first break in the legal proceedings came in March, and it came from the direction she'd least expected. Marsh came to the ranch. He came alone, on a gray morning when the snow was finally starting to consider giving up, and the mud season was making its preliminary announcements, and he tied his horse at the post and knocked at the door with the manner of a man who has been calculating the costs of several different decisions and has arrived at the one he thinks he can live with. Alara opened the door. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been told a great deal about her and was now reconciling what he'd been told with what he was seeing. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "is your husband here?" "He is," she said. "You can say what you need to say to both of us." Marsh worked his jaw for a moment. Then he came inside. Caleb was at the table. He looked at Marsh with an expression that was not welcoming and not hostile, the held look of a man waiting to hear a thing before deciding what to do with it. Marsh sat down without being asked, which meant he'd moved past formality into something that needed to get said. "The Commerce Inquiry," he started. "You've heard about it," Caleb said. "Everyone's heard about it." Marsh put his hat on his knee. He was not a young man, mid-50s, with the leathered look of someone who'd spent his life in the territory, and the specific tension around his eyes of someone who'd spent the last several weeks not sleeping well. "I've been running cattle sales for 15 years in this valley. I have a reputation." "You have," Alara said carefully. "Blackwell approached me in the spring of 1880, Marsh said. He said it like he was removing a coat that had gotten too heavy. He said the arrangement was simple. I'd adjust my commission structure in a way that reduced payments to certain sellers while maintaining standard rates with others. The difference went through a third account. I didn't—" He stopped. "I told myself the price differential was within normal market variation, that the sellers weren't being harmed in any way that wasn't already built into how markets work." The kitchen was very quiet. "But it wasn't market variation," Alara said. "No," Marsh said, "it was not." "Whose account did the differential go to?" Caleb said. "A land trust out of Helena. The trust's name is on paper. Blackwell's name isn't on anything." Marsh looked at the table. "But I know where the money went, and I have records." Alara looked at Caleb. He was very still. "Why are you here?" Caleb said. Marsh looked up. "Because your attorney's inquiry is going to find this eventually, and I'd rather be the man who came forward than the man who got dragged." He said it without self-justification, just the plain architecture of the decision. "And because I've been doing something I knew was wrong for 3 years, and I'd like it to stop." "You want immunity," Alara said. "I want to talk to your attorney," Marsh said. "What comes after that is his business." Alara held his gaze for a moment. He looked tired and smaller than she'd imagined him, sitting in this kitchen. Not the faceless mechanism she'd seen in the ledger numbers, but a man who had made a wrong choice and lived inside it for long enough that getting out felt like drowning and staying felt like the same thing. "I'll write to Darrow today," she said. "He'll want to meet with you this week." Marsh nodded. He stood. He looked at Caleb with something that was not quite an apology and not quite nothing. "Your father was a fair man," he said. "I should have. The arrangement started after he died. I should have come to you." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're here now?" Marsh put on his hat and went out. They heard his horse on the road, fading. Caleb sat at the table with his hands flat in front of him. Alara stayed where she was, giving the room a moment to settle. "This changes things," she said quietly. How much? If Marsh's records show the Helena Land Trust and Darrow can connect the trust to Blackwell, the Commerce inquiry becomes a criminal matter. The Territorial Attorney General would have to get involved. She paused. This isn't a civil case anymore, Caleb. This is criminal fraud. That's a different scale of consequence. He absorbed this. Blackwell will know Marsh talked. Yes. Then he'll move against us directly, not through lawyers and price manipulation. He'll try to make a statement that scares the others back, she said. Pruitt, Ellison, Forsyth. If he can make an example of someone before Darrow gets the Marsh information into the record, he can still collapse the coalition. Then we need to move faster than he does, Caleb said. Darrow needs those records by end of week, she said. She was already moving to the desk. And we need to tell the others, not by letter, in person, today. I'll go to Pruitt, Caleb said, standing. You go to Forsyth. Roy can get to the Vegas. Ellison, I'll send Thomas after I leave Pruitt's. He was already reaching for his coat. He stopped. Elara. She looked up from the desk. When this is over, stopped. Tried to say something and couldn't quite get to it. I was not a man who spoke easily about the future, she'd learned. It was a kind of optimism he'd trained himself out of by necessity and was only slowly finding his way back to. When this is over, she said, we'll figure out what comes next. He nodded. Something in him settled. He put on his coat and went out, and she heard him in the yard calling to Roy, and then the sound of horses on the road going in different directions. And she turned to the desk and wrote the fastest, most precise letter she had ever written to Henry Darrow in Miles City, laying out everything Marsh had said word by word while it was still fresh. And then she put on her coat and rode to Forsyth's, and the ranch hummed around her absence with people doing what needed doing, the way a thing runs when it has become, finally, more than one person holding it up. The confrontation she'd been expecting came 10 days later, not in the form she'd anticipated. She had been anticipating something against the property, more fence sabotage, possibly something more serious, the kind of physical intimidation that Blackwell had been holding in reserve while the legal and financial approaches did their work. What came instead was a visit, not Carver this time, Blackwell himself. Gideon Blackwell was 63 years old, and he had built his territory empire by understanding one principle very well, that the best time to deal with a problem was before it became expensive. He was a tall man, thin in the way of men who have never carried unnecessary weight of any kind, with white hair and the hands of someone who had once done physical work and remembered that he could. He came with one man, just one, which was a statement in itself, the confidence of someone who doesn't need to demonstrate force, because force is assumed. He tied his horse at the post and knocked at the door and waited, which was the behavior of someone who understood the value of appearing civilized. Caleb answered. Elara was at the desk, visible from the doorway. Voss, Blackwell said. Looked past him at Elara. And Mrs. Voss. I've been meaning to call for some time. Caleb stepped back from the door. Not an invitation, just the decision not to have this conversation on the porch in the cold, which would have been a disadvantage, and Caleb was not a man who accepted disadvantages he could avoid. Blackwell came in. His one man stayed outside with the horses. Blackwell sat down at the table without being asked, the same way Marsh had. But where Marsh had sat like a man putting down a weight, Blackwell sat like a man taking his rightful place. I'll be direct, he said. The filings your attorney has made are going to cost all of us time and money for no good outcome. The Commerce inquiry especially. These things drag on for years, and in the meantime you're spending money on legal fees you don't have, and I'm spending money on legal responses I'd rather spend on something productive. Then stop doing the things that are being filed about, Caleb said. Blackwell looked at him with something that might have been appreciation, in a different room, between different people. The Marsh matter is complicated, he said. Marsh made independent decisions about his commission structure that I was not. Mr. Blackwell, Elara said. He turned to look at her. The look of a man who is accustomed to women being in rooms but not in conversations. Marsh has already spoken to our attorney, she said. He has records, the Helena Land Trust account, the transfer structure, the dates, all of it. She let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. So the version of this conversation where you describe Marsh's decisions as independent is already behind us. Blackwell looked at her for a long moment. the kind of look that was evaluating rather than dismissing. She'd been dismissed enough to know the difference. "You're Edmund Whitmore's daughter," he said. "The attorney in Cincinnati." She hadn't expected him to know that. She didn't show it. "Yes. He and I had dealings years ago." He was thorough. A pause. "He didn't mention a daughter who read ledgers." "He didn't think it was relevant information," she said. "He was often wrong about what was relevant." Something moved across Blackwell's face. Not humor, but the recognition of a specific quality in someone. The way you recognize a chess player not by their pieces, but by how they hold the board. "What do you want?" he said. Not to Caleb, to her. "The Vega water rights restored and the delay with the county judge ended," she said. "The Forsyth boundary claim dropped. The commerce inquiry allowed to proceed without interference." She paused. "And the pricing arrangement, whatever replaced Marsh's structure, discontinued for every independent operation in the valley." "That's a great deal," he said. "It's less than what a territorial criminal proceeding would cost you," she said. Blackwell looked at Caleb. "You're letting her speak for you." "She's not speaking for me," Caleb said. "We're speaking together. There's a difference." Blackwell sat with this. He was not a man who had gotten where he was by being incapable of reading a situation. And what she watched him read now was the shape of what they'd built. Not just the legal filings, but the alliance, the shared cattle sales, the Ellisons and the Vegas and the Forsyths and Pruitt, the web of mutual investment that was harder to collapse than any single operation could be. "The commerce inquiry," he said finally. "If I settle the pricing matter directly with the affected parties, fair value restoration for the differential over the affected period." "Through an independent auditor," Alara said. "Not your people." "Through an independent auditor," he repeated, with the fractional pause of a man accepting a condition he'd hoped to avoid. "Then the inquiry might be resolved at a civil level, rather than escalating to the territorial attorney general." "It might," she said. "That's not our decision. That's Darrow's. But if restitution is made in good faith, it changes the nature of what he has to file." Blackwell looked at her one more time, then at Caleb, then around the room. The plain table, the stove, the desk with its organized papers, the window looking out over a yard that had been fought over and defended and kept. "I'll have my attorney contact Darrow by the end of the week," he said. He stood, picked up his hat. He looked at Alara. "Your father should have told people about you," he said. There was nothing warm in it, just the assessment of a man who had underestimated something and was noting the fact for future reference. "Yes," she said. "He should have." Blackwell went out. The door closed behind him. They heard the horses, the departure, the silence after. Roy appeared in the doorway from the back. He'd been there the whole time, she realized, positioned where he could be reached if needed. He looked at Caleb. "Well," Roy said. Caleb looked at the table, at the empty chair where Blackwell had sat, at Alara. "Write to Darrow," he said to her. His voice was steady, and something underneath it was not quite steady, the way water looks calm above a current. "Tell him what was said, every word." "I already started," she said. She had her pen in her hand. She had started writing the moment Blackwell turned toward the door. Roy made the sound that was not a laugh and went back outside. Caleb sat down in the chair across from her and put his hands on the table and looked at her writing, at the quick, efficient movement of her pen across the page, at the woman who had arrived in his yard 11 weeks ago as someone else's logistical problem, and had become the person who had just sat across a table from Gideon Blackwell and made him account for himself. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already hold, and he was a man who had learned slowly and with some difficulty that the silence between them had stopped being empty a long time ago. She wrote. He stayed at the table. Outside, the mud season was making its presence fully known, and the snow was giving up its long argument with the land, and somewhere on the south pasture, the cattle were moving toward the creek fence that had been repaired and held, and the valley was, for the first time in years, beginning to look like something that might actually be allowed to belong to the people who had built their lives on it. Darrow wrote back in 4 days, which was fast enough to tell her he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of movement. His letter was 3 pages, precise and unsentimental, the handwriting of a man who wrote a great deal and had stopped making it decorative. He confirmed that Blackwell's attorney had contacted him, a man named Pell, out of Helena, whom Darrow described as competent and realistic, which she translated as someone who had looked at the evidence and advised his client that fighting it was more expensive than settling it. Darrow outlined the terms he was proposing for the Commerce Inquiry resolution. Full restitution to each affected operation calculated against the pricing differential over the affected period, verified by an independent auditor from Billings, with a signed agreement that the arrangement with the Marsh Commission structure, and any successor arrangement operating on the same principle, was permanently dissolved. For the Vega water rights, he had filed the corrected burden of proof argument with a different territorial judge, one whose record suggested he was less susceptible to the kind of procedural patience that had been used to stall the original case. He expected a hearing within 6 weeks. For Forsyth, Blackwell's boundary claim had already been quietly withdrawn. No announcement, just a letter from Pell to Darrow indicating that his client had reviewed the survey documentation and determined the claim was not as strong as initially represented. Darrow's translation, in parentheses at the bottom of that paragraph, was, "He saw the easement and ran." She read the letter twice at the desk. Then she folded it and held it in both hands and sat quietly for a moment, not with triumph. She had learned enough about how things actually resolved to know that triumph was premature and usually wrong, but with something more durable than triumph, the feeling of a structure that had been built carefully, piece by piece, in cold weather and difficult soil, and had not fallen down. Caleb was in the barn. She went out to find him. He was repairing a harness with the focused patience he brought to mechanical problems, the kind of work that let his hands operate while his mind was somewhere else. He looked up when she came in, and she handed him the letter without speaking. He read it, handed it back. 6 weeks for the Vega hearing, he said. Darrow thinks it'll hold. The judge in Billings has no relationship with Blackwell's operations. And the restitution. The auditor comes next month. Every affected operation gets a statement of what they're owed. She paused. For us, Darrow estimates somewhere between $2,300 and $2,700, depending on how the auditor calculates the 1880 season. Caleb went back to the harness. Not dismissively. He was processing the way he processed things, through his hands. That's enough to finish the East Section development, she said. The grazing expansion we mapped in January. And with the Elwood arrangement holding at the spring rates, I know what it means, he said. Not sharply. Just the statement of a man who had been running numbers in his head for months and didn't need them narrated. I know you know, she said. He worked the harness for a moment. Then he said, without looking up, My father lost money for 3 years before he died. He never knew why. He thought it was him, that he'd made wrong decisions, that the land was failing because of something he'd done. He paused. He told me that, at the end, that he was sorry he was leaving me something that wasn't worth what it should have been. The barn was quiet. Outside, a horse moved in the adjacent stall with a soft shifting of weight. He wasn't wrong, Caleb said, about the decisions. He made some bad ones, but the land wasn't failing because of him. He set down the harness, looked at his hands. I'd like him to have known that. Alara stood in the barn and understood that this was not a thing that required a response. Not comfort, not practical reframing, not the next logical step. It was a man saying something he'd been carrying, and the carrying was the point, and what she could offer was simply to be in the room while he said it. He built something worth saving, she said finally. That's what he left you. Caleb picked up the harness again. Nodded once, the nod that meant he'd received something and was putting it somewhere it could stay. 6 weeks, he said. Then we see. The 6 weeks were not quiet. Blackwell's direct approach had changed, but Blackwell was not a man who stopped operating. He simply shifted tactics the way water shifts when one channel is blocked, finding the next available path. What he did in those weeks was legal and deliberate and calculated to extract whatever remaining value he could from the situation before the settlement closed around him. He sold the general store in Billings Crossing. Not to one of the Valley ranchers, not to anyone connected to the alliance. He sold it to a merchant family from Bozeman who had no local relationships and no knowledge of the history behind the transaction. The family was decent enough, as it turned out, and they adjusted the pricing within the first month because they understood that a store without customers was not a store. But the sale itself was a message. Blackwell was reducing his exposure in the valley, pulling back from the positions that were now documented and visible, cutting losses with the precision of a man who had built his empire by knowing when to retreat and retain rather than hold and lose everything. He also, through Pell, attempted to renegotiate the restitution terms. Not dramatically, a 10% reduction on the calculated differential, framed as accounting for market conditions that Darrow's model didn't fully capture. Darrow sent back a two-sentence letter declining and noting that the original terms were already conservative. Pell did not respond further. The auditor came in April, a dry, methodical man named Selkirk, who went through the combined records of every affected operation with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had been paid to find things and intended to find them. He spent 3 days at the Voss Ranch, 2 at Pruitt's, 1 each at the Ellisons, and the Vegas and Forsyths. He asked questions that were specific and answered others with the curt professionalism of a man who understood that his job was numbers, not reassurance. When he filed his report with Darrow in the 3rd week of April, the numbers were, in Darrow's subsequent letter, consistent with the plaintiff's estimates across all operations, with modest upward adjustments in 3 cases due to documented secondary effects on operational capacity. The Voss restitution figure came to $2,460. The Ellison figure was higher. They had been using Marsh longer. Pruitt's was the largest of all, which Roy said explained the particular expression on Pruitt's face when the letter arrived, an expression that Roy described as a man who had been told that his instinct about something was right, years too late, and had to decide whether to be satisfied or furious, and had apparently chosen both simultaneously. Alara deposited the restitution payment in the account she'd restructured in February, in the system she'd built with Caleb over 2 hours at the table, where the numbers were visible and the pricing patterns could be caught early. She recorded it in the ledger in her own handwriting, the 3rd handwriting the ledger had known, after Caleb's father and Mary, and it sat alongside both of theirs without apology. The Vega water rights hearing was in May, and she went. Caleb went with her. It was a 3-day ride to the territorial courthouse in the county seat, and they made it in weather that couldn't decide between spring and a final argument for winter, and they stayed in a boarding house that charged a fair price and served adequate food and had walls thin enough that they could hear the couple in the next room arguing about whether it was too early to plant corn. Antonio and Clara Vega were already at the courthouse when they arrived. Antonio was in his good coat, which had been brushed carefully, and still showed the crease where it had been folded in storage. Clara had her documents in a leather case that Alara recognized as the same one she'd brought to the initial meeting, now worn at the corners and full. Darrow was there, which she hadn't been certain of. He'd said he might send an associate. And seeing him in person for the first time was the small surprise that people always were when you'd known them only through their letters. He was taller than she'd imagined, and younger, and had the precise, unhurried manner of his writing translated into movement and speech. He shook her hand, then Caleb's, then spent 20 minutes with the Vegas going through the final preparation. She watched him work and understood why he'd been willing to take the water case on contingency. He believed in it, not as charity, but as the kind of case that established precedent, and lawyers who cared about precedent were a specific and useful type. The hearing took 4 hours. The judge, a man named Colfax, with the manner of someone who had seen a great deal of territorial legal maneuvering and was not interested in seeing any more of it, asked questions that were pointed and received Blackwell's attorney's arguments with the careful neutrality of someone who has already formed a preliminary view and is waiting to see if anything will change it. Nothing changed it. Colfax ruled from the bench at the end of the afternoon, which Darrow said was unusual and meant the judge considered the matter clear enough not to require extended deliberation. The ruling restored the Vega water rights in full, ordered Blackwell's upstream operation to remove the diversion structures that had been installed in violation of the original allocation, and assessed court costs against the party that had caused the delay, which was not the Vegas. Clara Vega made a sound in the gallery that was not a word. Antonio sat very still for a moment and then put his face in his hands, not crying exactly, but the physical response of a man whose body is releasing something it has held for 18 months, and is discovering that the holding had taken more than it seemed to at the time. Alara sat beside Caleb and looked at the courtroom and felt the weight of what had happened settle into something she could actually carry. Not the abstract satisfaction of a plan working, but the specific, human, irreducible fact of a family that was going to keep their land and their water and their 30 years of work on that ground. Caleb's hand found hers. Not demonstratively. Just his hand next to hers, and then the decision to let them stay that way, the gesture of a man who had been opening, incrementally, toward a version of himself that included this, that included her, and had arrived at the point where it didn't require an occasion to be true. She didn't look at him. She kept looking at the courtroom, at the Vegas, at Darrow stacking his papers with the calm of a man completing a task well done. But she held his hand. The settlement with the Commerce Inquiry was finalized in June, and when it was finalized, Blackwell's operation in the Valley was a different kind of entity than it had been. Still large, still present, but stripped of the mechanisms that had made it a predator rather than simply a competitor. The Helena Land Trust was dissolved as part of the settlement terms. The money in it went, in structured payments, back to the operations it had been extracted from, which was not the full amount. Darrow had been honest that a full recovery was unlikely, but was enough to constitute something real. Gideon Blackwell did not leave the territory. Men like him rarely did. They had too much invested, too much tied to the particular landscape they'd worked to control, and the control itself was not what they were ultimately after. He continued to operate his cattle business in the northern part of the territory, with less reach and under more scrutiny, and the stories about him that circulated in the valley changed over time, from the stories told about someone with power over you to the stories told about someone who had tried and failed, which is a completely different kind of story. He never came to the Voss Ranch again. He never sent a message through Carver again. He never, as far as anyone could tell, attempted to interfere with the Elwood arrangement or the independent operations of the Valley ranchers who had allied against him. Whether this was wisdom, defeat, or simply the recalculation of a practical man who had moved his attention elsewhere, Elara was not certain. She concluded it didn't matter, which was one of the more useful conclusions she'd reached in her life. The reasons a threat withdraws are less important than the fact that it has withdrawn, because you spend your energy on what is, not on the archaeology of what was. The summer of 1884 was the first summer the Voss Ranch ran at full capacity with the east section open, the creek fence intact, the cattle moving between grazing areas in the rotation she and Caleb had mapped together over the winter. The grass came up strong. The cattle numbers were the best since Caleb's father's best years, and by midsummer it was clear the fall count would beat them. Roy walked the east section with her in July, the two of them on horseback checking the fence line in a companionable silence that had developed over months of working alongside each other. He had never, in all the months since her arrival, said anything direct about her. Not complimentary, not critical, not personal. He'd communicated through the small practical currencies of respect, the way he started reporting to her as readily as to Caleb, the way he stopped positioning himself as the interpreter between her ideas and Caleb's decisions, the way he'd stood in that back doorway during the Blackwell meeting. At the far end of the east fence, he stopped his horse and looked at the grass and the cattle moving in it and said, "When you came here, I thought you'd be gone by spring." "Most people did," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "That doesn't happen as often as I'd like." It was the most personal thing he'd ever said to her, and he delivered it looking at the cattle rather than at her, which was the Roy Hubbard version of vulnerability, and she received it accordingly. "You helped make it possible," she said. "You and Dottie both. You could have made it much harder, and you didn't." Roy was quiet for a moment. "Caleb needed someone to argue with," he said. "Dottie and I couldn't do it. We knew him too well, and he knew he could outlast us." He paused. "You didn't know you couldn't outlast him, so you didn't try. You just kept going around." She laughed, a real one, caught off guard by the precision of it. Roy looked briefly satisfied in the way of a man who has made a correct observation and knows it. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, and the light on the grass was the long golden kind that makes everything look like it has been there always and will be there always, which is of course an illusion, but a productive one. But Thomas got married in August. This surprised almost everyone except Elara, who had noticed the way he talked about the Vega's niece, a girl named Rosaria, who had come to stay with Clara and Antonio in the spring, with a careful casualness that was the conversational equivalent of a man trying not to look directly at the sun. She had not said anything about it to anyone, which took a certain discipline, but she'd understood that some things needed to be left alone to develop on their own schedule. The wedding was small, at the Vega property, with the Valley families present. Martha Ellison brought a cake that was better than anything the territory deserved and was consumed with the speed of something that did not expect to be available long. Pruitt drank more than was advisable and made a speech that was roughly 40% coherent and 100% sincere. Forsyth danced, which was something none of them had known he did, and he did it badly and without apparent concern about this. Caleb stood beside Alara at the edge of the gathering and watched the people of the valley be people together. The thing she had known from the beginning was possible if anyone would let it happen. And he was not a man who talked much at gatherings like this. But she could feel that he was not uncomfortable in the way he'd once been uncomfortable. The way a man is uncomfortable when other people's happiness reminds him of a distance he can't cross. The distance had closed, incrementally, over months. "I want to expand the north pasture line next spring," he said, quietly, beside her. "I know," she said. "I've been running the figures for the fencing cost." "I thought you might have been." A pause. "Pruitt mentioned a joint purchase on the wire. Better rate if we order together." "I know about that too," she said. "Pruitt mentioned it to me last month." He looked at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved in the way it moved when he was amused and was not going to say he was amused. "Is there anything in this valley that gets said that you don't know about?" he said. "Not much," she admitted. "I've been here long enough." He nodded, looked back at the gathering. Thomas was dancing now too, not well, but with the total investment of a young man who does not care how he looks, because the person he is dancing with is the only audience that matters. Rosario was laughing. The sound of it carried. "More than a year," Caleb said. He was not talking about Thomas. "More than a year," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I told Roy when I went to Pruitt's, after the storm. I told him she's going to be here. Not the way I meant it with the 90 days. Permanently." He stopped. "Roy said he'd figured that out a while back." "What gave it away?" she said. "He said it was the moment I stopped arguing with you and started arguing toward you." He glanced at her. "I don't know what that means." "It means," she said, "that you stopped treating my ideas like challenges to your authority and started treating them like the other side of a conversation." "When did that happen?" "The fence repair," she said. "When you told me you'd help." He thought about this with the seriousness he brought to things he was placing in his permanent understanding of himself and the world. Then he nodded once. "That sounds right," he said. The autumn count was 380 head, which was the highest the Voss Ranch had recorded since 1878. Alara wrote the number in the ledger in her clean, efficient hand, under the column she'd restructured, in the system that made the numbers tell their story without hiding it. She looked at the number for a moment before closing the ledger. Then she opened it again and wrote, in the margin beside the figure, in smaller writing, "First full season, East Section operational, Elwood Arrangement Year 2. Not for anyone else, just for the record. Just so the ledger, which had held so much of what this ranch was, and had been, and had struggled to become, also held this, the shape of a thing that had turned around. She had thought, when she first opened that ledger in the first week, that it was a record of failure. She understood now that it was a record of pressure, of what a place and a family and a man could endure when someone was systematically extracting what they built and calling it the market. The failure was never in the land or in the work. The failure was in the isolation. One operation fighting alone against something designed to defeat individual operations was not a failure of will. It was a structural problem, and structural problems required structural solutions. She had believed this before she arrived. She believed it more completely now, having lived inside the proof of it. In October, her father wrote. The letter was the first direct communication from Edmund Whitmore since she'd left Cincinnati, and it arrived in a plain envelope with his precise attorney's hand on the front, and she held it for a long time before opening it. It was not an apology. She had not expected an apology. Her father was not built for them, and a man who had sent his daughter 2,000 miles without her consent was not going to discover remorse 18 months later without considerable external pressure. It was something more complicated than an apology, and in some ways harder to receive. It was a letter from a man who had heard things, through whatever channels men like him heard things, about what his daughter had done in Montana Territory, and who was writing to tell her that he had heard them. He described in his careful legal prose what had reached him: the settlement, the water rights case, the commerce inquiry, the Alliance of Valley Ranchers. He said his former colleague in the territorial bar had mentioned Darrow's name in connection with the matter, and that Darrow had mentioned hers. He said he had read the settlement terms with interest. He said the structure of the commerce argument was sound. He did not say he was sorry for what he'd done. He did not say she had been right and he had been wrong. He did not say any of the things that would have made the letter clean or simple. What he said, at the end, in a sentence that she read 3 times before putting the letter down, was, "I did not know what I was arranging when I made the arrangement. I am not certain it matters whether I did." She sat with this for a long time. It was not forgiveness she felt. Forgiveness was a thing that happened in its own time and on its own terms, and could not be rushed by deciding to feel it. What she felt was something more like recognition. The recognition of a man who had made a wrong thing and knew it, and could not say so directly because the direct road was not available to him, and was saying it the only way he could, which was sideways, through the acknowledgement of what she had done with what he had put her through. She wrote back. The letter was short. She told him the ranch was profitable. She told him the valley was in better condition than it had been in a decade. She told him she was well. She did not invite him to visit, and she did not foreclose it. She signed it Alara Voss, which was the first time she had used that name in writing to anyone from her previous life, and the name felt on the page exactly like what it was, real, chosen, hers. She sealed the letter and set it with the outgoing mail and went to find Caleb. I was at the North Pasture Line, planning the spring expansion with Roy, both of them standing in the cooling October air, with stakes and string and the serious expressions of men engaged in the specific pleasure of planning something they believe in. She stood at the edge of their work and watched them argue about the northeast corner setback in the comfortable, unresolved way of 2 people who have been having versions of the same argument for years and expect to have more versions of it, which is itself a form of continuity. Caleb saw her and tilted his head. The question. "My father wrote," she said. Roy suddenly found the northeast corner extremely interesting. Caleb walked over to her. "What did he say?" "That he heard about the settlement." She paused. That he didn't know what he was arranging." Caleb looked at her. "But he knows now." "He knows now." "And?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about hard things, without the version she wished were true getting in the way of the version that was. "He's my father," she said. "That doesn't fix what he did. But it doesn't go away either." She looked at the pasture, at the stakes Roy had put in for the expansion line. "I wrote back. I told him the ranch was well." "That's more than he deserves," Caleb said. "Probably," she said. "But I wrote it for me, not for him." He nodded. Understood, without her having to explain it, that there was a kind of generosity that was not about the recipient, that you extended not because the other person had earned it, but because carrying the alternative was a weight you didn't want to keep paying to carry. It was not a noble thing. It was a practical one. And he was, at his foundation, a practical man who had learned to understand practical things about the heart. "Come look at the northeast corner," he said. "Roy's wrong about the setback, and I want a second opinion." "I'm not wrong," Roy said, without turning around. "You're often wrong," Caleb said. "Name a time." "March, the south fence post depth." "That was a soil condition issue, not—" She walked into their argument, and they made room for her without interrupting the argument, which was the best possible version of being let in. And they stood in the October light with the stakes and the string and the rolling Montana grass around them, and argued about the northeast corner setback with the comfortable intensity of people who were going to be here for the next argument and the one after that. By the time the second winter came, the Voss Ranch was operating as part of something that didn't have an official name, but functioned like a cooperative in all the ways that mattered: shared purchasing, shared labor at critical points, shared legal standing through the framework Darrow had built and continued to maintain out of Miles City. The name people used for it, informally, in the way that informal names become the real ones, was the Valley Arrangement. Alara had heard it first from Martha Ellison, who mentioned it in conversation the way you mention something that has been true for a while and doesn't require introduction. She had not chosen the name. She had not organized a naming. It had happened the way actual things happen, through use, through the accumulation of occasions on which it was the right word for a real thing. Martha's daughter, the 8-year-old, whose name was June, had started riding over to the Voss Ranch on Saturdays. Nobody had arranged this exactly. June had simply appeared one Saturday morning, riding a pony with the absolute self-possession of a child who has decided somewhere is a good place to be and has acted on this information. And Alara had given her coffee, weak, with a great deal of milk, and shown her the ledger system. And June had sat for 2 hours with the solemn attention of a child who is being taken seriously and is taking the experience seriously in return. After that, it became a Saturday thing. Caleb found this development initially baffling, and then, over several Saturdays, simply a fact of life that the house had acquired. I was not naturally easy with children. Not unkind, just uncertain, the way people are uncertain with things they have no established script for. But June was not a child who required much management. She mostly wanted to know how things worked, which was a question Caleb could answer all day. And so they had developed a Saturday ritual in which June followed Caleb around the property, asking why. And Caleb answered with the patience of a man who found the question more interesting than he'd expected to find it. One Saturday in November, Alara was at the desk and could hear them through the window. Caleb explaining the principle of the cattle rotation, June asking increasingly specific follow-up questions, Caleb's voice doing the thing it did when he was engaged with something and had stopped monitoring his own engagement. She listened to it and felt something she didn't have a precise word for, the compound feeling of watching a person you love be a version of themselves that they didn't know they were capable of. She had not said that word to him yet. Love. Not allowed. They had arrived at it the way they'd arrived at most things, through the accumulation of actions that were its expression, without the formal declaration that would have required one or both of them to be a different kind of person. She did not think the word required saying to be true. She was not, however, entirely certain he knew. She went outside. June was explaining something back to Caleb now. She had absorbed the rotation principle and was applying it to a theoretical question about what would happen if you had 2 creek lines instead of 1. Caleb was listening with the expression of a man who has been asked something that is actually interesting. Alara stood at the edge of this and waited until there was a natural pause. June, she said, there are biscuits if you want them. June weighed the cattle rotation theory against biscuits for approximately half a second and went inside. Caleb watched her go. She's going to be something, he said. She already is, Alara said. He looked at her, the open face, the one she'd stopped finding surprising. What? He said. He could tell when she had something to say. Nothing specific, she said. I was listening from inside, the 2 of you. He looked at the barn, in the way he looked at things he didn't want to examine too directly. I'm not good with, you're better than you think, she said. You're better than you were. He turned this over. Then, are you going to tell me that's because of you? No, she said. That's because of you. You let it happen. She held his gaze. That's the harder part. He was quiet. The November air was very still, the kind of stillness that comes before weather changes, and the light had the flat white quality of a sky that had something in mind. I've been thinking, he said, about the east section development, the grazing capacity if we pushed it through the south draw. I know, she said. The figures work. I know the figures work. I wanted to... He stopped, tried again. I wanted to ask what you thought about the timeline, whether you thought next spring was right or whether we wait another year and do it properly. She looked at him. It was not a financial question. He knew the answer to the financial question. The question he was asking, the one underneath it, was whether she saw the same future in the same time, whether she was planning with him at the same distance. Not 90 days, not a year, but the further horizon, the one that required you to be certain enough about a thing to arrange your plans around it. Next spring, she said, do it properly and do it next spring. We have the capital and the labor and the plan. She paused. We have everything we need. He nodded. Slowly, with the weight he put on things that were going into the permanent record of his understanding. Next spring, then, he said. They went inside where June had found the biscuits and was explaining the cattle rotation theory to Roy, who was receiving it with the expression of a man who is being told something he already knows by someone he has decided to let tell him anyway, because the telling is its own good thing. Years move differently when you're inside them than they look from outside. From outside, the story of the Voss Ranch in the decade after 1883 looked like a straight line upward, the numbers improving, the operation expanding, the valley arrangement strengthening into something that the Territorial Commerce Office eventually cited as a model for small rancher cooperation. From inside, it was not a straight line. It was the honest, crooked shape of actual things. The spring of 1886, when they lost a third of the East herd to a disease that moved through the region, and there was nothing to do but absorb the loss and rebuild. The year Roy's eyesight began failing, and they had to renegotiate what his role looked like, which was a conversation that nobody wanted to have, and which Roy initiated himself with characteristic directness. The drought year, when the creek ran low and the grazing rotation had to be adjusted, and Caleb and Alara spent 3 weeks barely sleeping, running numbers and moving cattle and arguing about the right call, loudly and specifically, and without either of them letting the argument become about anything other than the cattle. And then the resolution of the argument, which they were both wrong about in different ways, and which worked out well enough, and which they didn't discuss much afterward because some arguments are about the working through rather than the outcome. Thomas and Rosaria had a daughter, then twin boys, which Thomas described as a logistical situation he had not anticipated and was managing. The valley grew by a few operations in the middle years. Families who came knowing the arrangement existed and chose the valley specifically because of it, which was something Alara could not have predicted, and which she found moving in a way that was hard to articulate. The way it's hard to articulate why a thing you made with difficulty being treated as simply a feature of the landscape by people who didn't have to make it should feel like more than success. June Ellison grew up and left for Billings for 2 years, and came back with a law degree and an intention to practice in the territory, which was not common for women in 1894, but was not, in the Valley Arrangement's corner of Montana, treated as remarkable. She set up in Billings Crossing in the office that had been a hardware store. Her first client was Antonio Vega, who had a new water rights question that had emerged from the expansion of the operation. Her second client was Pruitt, who had a contract dispute with a supplier. Her third client was Alara Voss, who had a question about the legal structure of the Valley Arrangement and whether it could be formalized in a way that would give it standing independent of the individual operations. June worked on this question for 2 months and came back with a document that was, in Darrow's opinion when she sent him a copy, technically rigorous and practically sound, which was the highest compliment Darrow's vocabulary extended toward other legal work. They signed the Articles of the Valley Arrangement, the formal version, with all the ranches named, and the terms specified, at the Voss Ranch, at the table in the kitchen where all the significant conversations had happened, with Caleb and Alara and the Ellisons, and the Vegas and Pruitt, and Forsyth and Thomas and Roy and Dottie, all present, and June Vega, formerly Ellison, presiding with the careful seriousness of a lawyer who knows that a thing being official is part of what makes it real. Dottie made a cake that was lopsided and excellent, which was what Dottie's cakes always were. And nobody commented on the lopsidedness because by now they understood it was structural to the experience and would not be improved by comment. Caleb signed the articles and passed the pen to Alara, and she signed them and felt the weight of the pen and the paper and the table and the room and everything that had happened in and around it in the years between the day she'd arrived in the mud with a carpet bag and $12.40 and this moment, and the weight was not burden but substance, the heft of things that are real. There is a thing people say about strong women, that they don't need anyone, that their independence is the point of them, that the story ends when they have demonstrated their capacity and the world has acknowledged it. Alara had heard versions of this her whole life, had been told by her father and by the world her father operated in, that a woman with a mind like hers was either a tool to be used or an inconvenience to be managed, and that the story of such a woman was either about her usefulness or her failure. Neither of those was the real story. She understood that now, in the complete way you understand things you have lived through rather than observed. The real story was not that she had arrived and fixed a failing ranch. She had not fixed it. She had seen it clearly and found people willing to see it clearly alongside her, and together they had built something that none of them could have built alone. That was not her story. It was theirs. All of them. The Vegas and the Ellisons and Forsyth and Pruitt and Roy and Dottie and Thomas and June, and at the center of it, a man who had thrown papers in the mud on the first day and had spent every day since becoming someone who would not do that. Caleb Voss was not a changed man in the way stories sometimes describe change, the dramatic reversal, the single moment of conversion. He was a changed man in the way that real change happens, which is slowly, through friction and resistance and small decisions made over long periods of time, until you look up one day and realize the person standing in the same boots is not the same person who put them on. He had not become easy or demonstrative or given to speeches about what he felt. I was still the man who spoke through action, who showed you what mattered by how he arranged his time and his labor and his attention. But the action had changed. The labor included her. The attention was no longer the measuring look, but the one underneath it, the one that had learned to stay. He had told her once, late, in the particular honesty of very late nights, that the hardest thing about the first months was not that she challenged his decisions. It was that she was right often enough that not listening cost more than the pride of listening. And the second he'd started actually listening, he'd realized she was not trying to take anything from him. She was trying to add to it. And that was the thing he hadn't been able to see from inside the wall he'd built, which was that strength and help were not opposites, and that a person who makes you stronger is not a threat to your strength. She had said, when he told her this, "I know. I knew the whole time. I just had to wait for you to figure it out." He had said, "How did you know I would?" She had said, "I didn't. But the alternative was leaving, and I'd already decided not to do that." He had been quiet for a moment, then, "What made you decide?" She had thought about it honestly. "The fence?" she'd said, "when you said you'd help." He had looked at her. "That was the first week." "I know," she'd said. "It doesn't take long sometimes to know what a person can become. It just takes a long time for them to get there." He had not said anything to that, but he had taken her hand in the dark, the way he'd taken it in the courthouse, without announcement or occasion. Just the decision that this was true and had been true, and would continue to be true, and the hand was how you said it when you were a man who spoke through what you did rather than what you declared. She had let it be enough. It was enough. It had always been enough. This is what nobody tells you about arriving somewhere you were never supposed to belong. The belonging, when it comes, does not come with fanfare. It comes in the ordinary increments of days, in being the person who knows where things are kept, who understands the particular creak of the third porch step, whose opinion is sought before decisions are made. It comes in the specific trust of being left in charge of something someone else built and having the judgment to extend it rather than diminish it. It comes in a ring that fits, in a ledger written in 3 hands, in a little girl on a pony who rides over on Saturdays because she has decided this is a good place to be. Alara Voss had arrived in the mud of a yard in Montana Territory as a problem to be solved, and she had become the woman who understood that the only problems worth solving were the ones everyone else had agreed were unsolvable. She had not done it perfectly. She had made mistakes and miscalculated and lost sleep and lost cattle and lost arguments and started over. She had been stubborn in ways that cost her, and strategic in ways she was not always proud of, and impatient in ways she had learned to manage but never entirely tamed. She was not a legend. She was a woman who had looked at a failing thing and refused to look away, and had found, in the refusing, a life that was not the one she'd been given, but the one she had chosen, which is the only kind worth having. The ledger sat on the desk, the ranch ran, the valley arrangement held, the east section grass came up green every spring, and the cattle moved through it in the rotation she'd mapped, and the numbers in the ledger told their story clearly. No hiding, no erosion dressed up as weather. Outside, Montana went about its business, the light changing over the grass, the seasons arguing with each other in the way seasons do, the land remaining what land always remains, indifferent to the dramas played out on it, patient beyond patience, available to anyone willing to stay long enough to learn its terms. She had stayed. She had learned. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.